Yo, what's up everyone? It's Cross Harry, and today we're checking out what if the Morphin Grid chose Harry at birth and Power Rangers made Dumbledore fear true power. Drop a like if you're hyped, subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1. The Grid always picks the loneliest kid in the room. The cupboard under the stairs was 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, and Harry had measured both dimensions with his feet before he was old enough to know the words for either. 3 adult foot lengths, heel to toe, corner to corner. 6 if he stretched diagonally, which he had to do now that he was 11 and the diagonal was running out of room. He was lying on the cot in the dark, listening to the house. Privet Drive had a sound architecture he knew as well as his own breathing, the refrigerator's tick, the central heating's argument with itself at 3 in the morning, Vernon's footsteps, which were a whole grammar on their own. Right now it was early morning, and the house was in its lightest sleep, the pre-dawn quiet where nothing had started yet, and Harry lay on his back with his hands on his sternum and felt the grid run its low frequency through the mattress springs and up through his palms and settle. He didn't call it the grid, he didn't call it anything. It was just the warmth, the hum, the 3-inch below the sternum constant that had been there since before he had memories. He'd spent years trying to find a name for it from the inside, from the experience of lying in the dark, feeling something vast and warm, and very old, patiently occupying the same space as an 11-year-old boy in a cupboard on a Surrey cul-de-sac, and had eventually concluded that names were the wrong tool. The thing didn't need a name, it needed acknowledgement. He gave it that every morning, hands flat on his chest, paying attention. And he got up. He had 15 minutes before Vernon's alarm. He used them to dress. The clothes hung on a hook screwed into the wall beside the hot water pipe, Dudley's old things, which were large enough that Harry had taught himself a series of efficient tucks and folds that made them functional if not presentable, and to sit on the cot and think about the letters. There had been one yesterday, one the day before that 3. They had been addressed in green ink, with his name and the very specific address that included the cupboard under the stairs, which was the detail that had made Vernon go the color he went when his blood pressure was doing something inadvisable. Vernon had burned them. Today's would be in the post before Harry started breakfast. The grid had been pointing at the letters the way a compass points north, not urgently, not with any particular drama, just with the patient gravitational lean it used when it wanted Harry to notice something. He had noticed. He had also noticed the way Vernon's voice had changed when talking about them, rising from irritation to the specific register of a man confronting evidence that the world contains more than he has decided to allow. Vernon's allowed world was a very specific shape. Letters addressed to the cupboard didn't fit in it. Harry didn't know what was in them. He knew they were his. He knew something was coming, in the same way he'd always known things before he had a language for the knowing, the grid's tilt, its lean, its quiet gravitational commentary on approaching events. Something was coming soon. Something had been waiting until now, until he was 11, until some threshold had been crossed. The alarm went off. He was already at the cooker. Vernon Dursley had the particular quality of a man who believed very strongly in normal. Normal was a shape he had built around himself and his family with decades of careful exclusion, normal houses, normal jobs, normal children, nothing that required explaining to the neighbors. Harry had spent 11 years being the specific exception Vernon could not exclude, which was the source of most of their communication. Today, Vernon ate his eggs and did not speak to Harry. This was different from the usual silent treatment, which had a sullen quality. This was a deliberate silence, the silence of someone with a plan. Petunia drank her tea and did not look at the table. Dudley, already dressed for nothing in particular, ate cereal with the oblivious efficiency of someone whose internal life is a wide, uncrowded space. Harry made tea he wasn't going to be invited to drink, washed the pan, and waited. The post slot rattled. Vernon was up before the rattle finished. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides, a large man moving with uncharacteristic speed, and went to the front door and came back with an expression that had bypassed his face's usual processing and landed directly in alarm. He had a letter. The envelope was thick. The address was in green ink. He looked at Harry. His eyes went to Harry's sternum. They went away again. Going away, Vernon said. He had the delivery of a man who has rehearsed this but lost confidence in the rehearsal. All of you, holiday, we're leaving today. Petunia said, Vernon, today, Vernon said. Harry dried his hands on the towel and turned around. I'll pack, he said. Vernon stared at him. He had expected, Harry thought, some question, some resistance, some ordinary child's confusion at sudden disruption. What he got was a boy who had already understood the shape of the next 24 hours and was being practical about it. Good, Vernon said, which was not the response he'd been building toward, but it was the response available. They drove to a hotel. Then they drove to another one, because Vernon had spotted something he considered wrong with the first one, which was that it had a man in the lobby who was reading a very large book. They ended up in a bed and breakfast outside Walking that had the specific quality of a place where nothing has happened for 30 years, and the owners take pride in this. Vernon locked them in the rooms and sat in front of the door. The letters arrived anyway. 12 of them under the door while Vernon was sleeping against it. Harry lay in the single bed along the far wall and listened to the envelopes whisper across the carpet and felt the grid run gold through the dark of the room and thought, soon, they went further. Cottage on a rock in the sea, accessible by rowboat, which Vernon had rented from a man at the coastal village who had looked at Vernon's expression and decided not to ask questions. The cottage was gray stone and had a fireplace that didn't draw well and one room with 4 camp beds arranged in a pattern that suggested Vernon had originally planned a different layout and changed his mind several times. Harry had the camp bed nearest the window. The window looked out on the water, which was dark and purposeful, with the specific energy of deep water near a storm. The sky had been building all evening, clouds with cargo, the grid reading the weather the way it read everything, a frequency in the atmospheric pressure that said overnight. Harry lay on the camp bed and listened to the storm arrive. He did not sleep. Not because he was afraid, he wasn't. The grid was steady. The approaching thing it had been tracking all week was very close now, measurable in hours, but because sleeping on a night like this seemed like the wrong use of the time. He lay on his back with his hands on his sternum and felt the warmth run through his palms and thought about what was coming. The storm hit at midnight. The waves hit the rock. The window rattled in its frame. The door came off its hinges at midnight plus 14 minutes. The man who filled the doorway was enormous in the specific way that geography is enormous, not threatening exactly, but present in a way that changed the dimensions of the room simply by occupying a portion of them. He was wearing a coat that might have been several coats, or possibly an entire climate. He had a lamp that burned orange in the dark. His beard was wild and wet from the storm, and he was breathing with the comfortable depth of someone for whom weather was a personal acquaintance. He looked around the room, found Harry in the camp bed by the window, and his face did something, a fast, complicated sequence that was trying to be simple. He said, "Harry. Got some at fur, yeah?" He held up the lamp. "Happy birthday." From under one arm, he produced a box. It had the specific architecture of something that had been carried some distance with care. A cake, pink iced, the letters slightly crooked, "Happy birthday, Harry." He set it on the floor. Then he looked at Harry with the direct, uncomplicated warmth of someone whose affections have always been large-scale, and Harry felt something in his chest move that was separate from the grid, something smaller and more personal and slightly fragile at its edges, the way things are when they haven't been used much. He sat up. "I'm Harry," he said, which was not much of a contribution but was honest. "No, yeah are," the man said. "I'm Hagrid. Keeper o' keys at Hogwarts. Been given the job o' bringin' you your letter personally, seein' as the regular post wasn't working out." He looked at the floor, where 311 letters had, over the preceding week, accumulated in corners and under furniture. He looked back at Harry. "Also wanted ter see ye myself," he said, and his voice had dropped slightly, the way voices drop when the real thing is being said. "You're the image of your dad, got your mum's eyes, though." The grid ran warm. Vernon made a sound from across the room, a bluster sound, the specific vocal register he used to announce that he was about to reassert the boundary between his normal world and whatever was encroaching on it. Hagrid looked at him briefly, with the incurious assessment of a man who has seen a great many things, and found Vernon Dursley a very small entry in the catalogue, and then looked back at Harry. "You know what Hogwarts is?" Hagrid asked. "No," Harry said, which was honest. Hagrid told him. The grid had known in the way it knew things, not in language, but in orientation, in the steady gravitational line towards something that had been approaching for 11 years. As Hagrid spoke, Harry felt the knowing translate itself from frequency into words, from sensation into fact. Wizard, magic school. His parents had been the same. Wizard, he turned it over carefully. It was a new name for an old reality, and it fit with the specific fit of a garment cut for someone's exact dimensions. It didn't explain everything. It didn't explain the specific quality of the grid's warmth, which was different from what Hagrid was describing, more foundational, less transactional. But it was closer to the truth than anything the Dursleys had ever offered, and it was his. Vernon attempted an intervention. He did it with the voice he used for business meetings and planning permission disputes, the voice of a man who believes that sufficient authority of tone is equivalent to authority of fact. Hagrid handled it with the ease of someone who has never once in his life been concerned about Vernon Dursley's tone, and produced from his coat, eventually, an umbrella that was probably not actually an umbrella. Dudley, having found the cake and eaten most of it, was now in a corner with a pig's tail that had not been there before. Harry stood and picked up the letter. He turned it over. green wax seal, a crest he didn't know, his name in the same green ink as all the others, Mr. H. Potter, the floor of a hut on the sea. The address made him decide something. Whatever had been addressed to the cupboard and then the floor had been watching. Knew exactly where he was, had always known, and had been trying to reach him through every conventional method first before sending a person. That was careful. It was also, he thought, a gesture of respect, the letters before the messenger, the normal before the extraordinary, an attempt to let him receive information in the most ordinary way available. He appreciated the attempt. He opened the envelope. Diagon Alley arrived through the back wall of a pub that smelled of old magic and breakfast, and it was everything a city is when you encounter it for the first time with no frame of reference, total, immediate, its own argument. The sounds in the crowds in the shop fronts leaning toward each other above the cobblestones, the owls and the cauldron sellers, and the children pressed to glass, looking. Harry walked through it, and the grid reacted the way it reacted in new environments. Awake, cataloging, the compass spinning gently as it found its bearings in a place where everything vibrated at a frequency adjacent to its own. Gringotts was marble and certainty and goblins, who looked at Harry with the specific assessment of beings who have seen several thousand years of human affairs, and arrived at conclusions not entirely flattering to the species. His vault was underground, behind a cart ride that the grid found interesting, the gravitational geometry of the descent, the way the rails curved, the thermal signature of rock at depth, and contained gold that he had not known about, which was information that required some internal rearrangement. He bought his things methodically. Hagrid moved through the alley with the confidence of a man whose size had never been a social inconvenience among people who were used to extraordinary things. Robes, books, parchment, an owl. She was white and looked at him with the bright intelligence of something that had decided on him specifically, and he looked back and the grid gave a gentle affirmative tick, and the decision was made on both sides. Ollivander's was last. The shop occupied a narrow slice of the alley with the complete self-possession of a place that has never needed to compete for attention. The bell above the door made a sound that resonated in the grid's register, not the same note, but neighboring, the way two instruments in the same key sound when one hears the other tune. Harry stood in the entrance and felt the back of the shop pulling at his attention with the patient insistence of a question that had been waiting. Ollivander was behind the counter in the same moment the door had finished opening, moving from wherever he'd been with the seamless speed of the genuinely old, whose relationship with space has become, over decades, more of a negotiation. His eyes were pale and very clear, and they found Harry's with the direction of a man who had been expecting a specific customer for some time and was assessing the gap between expectation and arrival. "Mr. Potter," he said, then he stopped. His eyes moved to Harry's sternum, the same involuntary shift, the same brief refocus, but unlike Vernon's revulsion and unlike Snape's future recognition, Ollivander's expression was the expression of a craftsman confronting an unprecedented technical problem and finding it, on balance, wonderful. "Your wand arm," he said. The measuring tape went to work. It moved around Harry with the cheerful efficiency of something that had been doing this for 9 centuries and had developed strong opinions about the relevant measurements. Ollivander turned to the shelves. He returned with a wand. The first one. Harry closed his hand around it, and the grid ran through it the way current runs through a conductor that has the wrong resistance, not stopped, not exactly, but altered, distorted, the frequency arriving at the wand's tip as something other than what it had been at the handle. The glass in the corner cracked. Ollivander took the wand back without comment and made a note. The second, the grid went in and nothing came out at the tip, the wand simply absorbing the frequency without translation, a dead end. A stack of boxes toppled from a shelf. The third, the wand's phoenix feather core and the grid tried to negotiate a working relationship and couldn't find common ground. The energy distribution was wrong. The feather had been wound too tight, and when Harry moved the wand in the motion Ollivander demonstrated, a sound came from somewhere inside the walls that had no business being there and no natural explanation. Ollivander wrote down 3 different things. "Curious," he said to himself, in the voice of a man for whom curious was a professional pleasure rather than a social observation. "Very curious. The wand chooses the wizard, Mr. Potter, that has always been true, but I am finding that the principle requires some extension in your particular case." He disappeared into the shelves. The shop was very quiet. The grid was very awake. The wand Ollivander returned with was 11 inches, holly phoenix feather. It was the third box from the bottom of a stack in the far corner, which was where old stock went, not the shop's best guesses, but the deep-cut entries, the wands that had been waiting a long time for the right frequency to walk through the door. Harry took it and the grid integrated. Not a rush, not a flare. The integration was smooth and thorough, the quality of 2 systems that have been designed to work together finding each other after a long separation. Gold light moved from the tip down the shaft to the handle, and through Harry's palm and up his arm, and dissolved somewhere around his shoulder, and the wand settled into his grip, with the specific weight of something that had arrived where it was going. Ollivander's breath went out of him in a very controlled way. "Curious," he said again, but the tone had changed. This was not professional pleasure. This was something closer to reverence, with an undercoat of relief. He took a step forward and looked at Harry's hand around the handle, then looked up at Harry's face. "I remember every wand I have ever sold, Mr. Potter. Every one. This one," he paused, "I made it for no one I could name. I knew it needed a specific quality that I could not specify in standard terms. I waited 41 years for the correct customer." He closed Harry's fingers more firmly around the handle. "It will translate for you, not generate. You understand the distinction. The grid generates," Harry said. "The wand is the vocabulary." Ollivander looked at him for 3 seconds. "That had a specific quality, the quality of a man deciding whether to pursue a question or acknowledge that the question has answered itself. He chose the latter. 7 galleons, he said, and smiled, and the smile had more information in it than anything he'd said out loud. He walked with them to the door and watched them go into the alley's afternoon, and his expression in the moment before the door closed was 90% scholarship and 10% relief. And the relief was the relief of a man who has been holding a responsibility that now belongs to someone else. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at precisely 11 in the morning, which required finding platform 9 3/4, which required running at a brick wall, which required the specific combination of physical commitment and the grid's confidence that the architecture would cooperate. It did. Harry came through into the steam and the crowd and the red train, and felt the grid register its approval of the environment with a warm affirmative hum. He found a compartment toward the rear of the train. He put his trunk up and sat down and looked out the window at the platform, which was organized chaos, families of varying sizes managing trunks and owls, and the logistics of departure. Boy, his height was being instructed by an extremely capable-looking woman in a pointed hat. Not his mother. The posture was wrong: to write home, eat properly, and not do anything that would embarrass the Weasley name, the last of which was delivered with the specific emphasis of someone who considers it possible. The boy boarded the train and walked the corridor and stopped at Harry's compartment and looked in with the assessment of someone who has grown up sharing space and has clear criteria for acceptable compartment mates. "Everywhere else is Draco Malfoy," the boy said. "Can I sit here?" "Yeah," Harry said. The boy dragged his trunk in and sat down across from Harry with the easy physical confidence of someone whose body has never been taught to take up less space. He had freckles and an honest face and robes that had been let out at the sleeves with a slightly different thread. He said Ron Weasley, the way people say things they've said 1,000 times, Harry Potter. Ron's eyes went to Harry's fringe and found the scar and returned to Harry's face, and then he did not mention it. He said instead, "You want some sandwiches? Mum packed about 40. She does that when she's worried." "Yeah," Harry said, "thanks." Ron passed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. It was ham and mustard, and it was very good. They ate in companionable quiet while the platform outside moved and then disappeared as the train pulled north. Hermione arrived approximately 20 minutes later, or more precisely, the compartment door opened and Hermione Granger stepped in mid-sentence, addressing the second half of an explanation to the person she'd been talking to in the corridor before pivoting to survey the new space without pausing for breath. She had a book under one arm, a cat under the other, and the expression of someone who had been organizing her approach to Hogwarts for approximately 2 years. "I'm looking for a toad," she said, cataloging the compartment. "Boy named Neville lost one. I said I'd help." "I don't see a toad in here." Her eyes reached Harry. They stopped. The cataloging continued, but at a different speed, the specific speed of a mind rearranging a filing system in real time. "You're Harry Potter." "People keep noting that," Harry said. "I've read about what happened to you," she said, which was not the same thing as "I know all about you," which she was careful not to say because she recognized the distinction between evidence in the historical record and the actual person in front of her, even if most people didn't. Or rather, I've read about what's recorded. Most of the academic accounts are incomplete and several contradict each other, and there's a significant gap around the specific mechanics of what actually occurred at Godric's Hollow, which I find," she sat down, because continuing to stand while explaining was inefficient. "I'm Hermione Granger." "I've already read all the course textbooks." "Have you?" "Some of them." "Which ones?" "The ones about things older than wands," Harry said. Hermione's sentence, which had been 3 clauses into building towards something about the OWL-relevant curriculum, stopped. She ran the filing system again, opened a new drawer. "I don't think the curriculum covers that specifically," she said carefully. "No," Harry agreed, "it doesn't." She looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has built her intellectual world on the premise that everything interesting is, eventually, findable in a book, and who is encountering for the first time someone who implies that there are interesting things living outside the bibliography. She did not dismiss it. She filed it as a primary source and took out a notebook. Ron, who had been watching the last of the platform towns disappear into countryside, said, "What's the Morphin Grid?" Harry looked at him. "Where did you said things older than wands," Ron said, which was not an answer. He shrugged. "Just the first thing that came to mind." He looked at Harry with the expression of someone who is not performing a casual observation, who is actually casually observing. "You're not surprised about magic, are you? Any of it. You're not." He made a gesture at the train, the world. "You knew already." "Not specifics," Harry said. "Just that something was true." "The grid," Ron said, and he said it the way someone says a word they've heard in their sleep. "I don't know that name," Harry said. "Or I didn't, it just resonates." Hermione had her notebook open. She was writing very small letters in the top margin, which was not the space she usually used for notes, which meant this was separate from her organized system, something she was capturing before it moved. She underlined whatever she'd written twice and said, without looking up, "Tell me what it feels like." Harry looked at her. He thought about the cupboard and the mornings and the grid's warm constant and Ollivander saying translator, not engine, and he said, "Like a river in a very specific channel." "Everything I do is the channel. The river is just what's in it." Hermione's pen moved. Ron ate a pasty and looked at the hills going by outside and said, "Wicked." Draco Malfoy arrived an hour outside London, with two companions who were both large and occupied the doorway in the way of people whose function is to occupy doorways. Harry had been watching the countryside change, the specific pleasure of landscape seen from a moving vehicle, the world arranging itself into before and after, the fields and hills scrolling past like a document you're reading at a comfortable pace. He registered the door opening and registered who was in it before he turned, because the grid had a way of informing him of the people in his spatial field with a gentle accuracy that didn't require eye contact. Malfoy was neatly arranged and pale, and had the posture of a boy who had been placed in the center of photographs his entire life, and had arrived at the conclusion that this was the natural geometry of things. He looked at Ron with the expression of someone completing a transaction they find distasteful. He looked at Hermione, and the expression sorted her into a category. He looked at Harry, and the expression was different. It was looking for something specific, a particular configuration of gratitude or uncertainty or raw material that he could work with, and not finding it. "Heard Harry Potter was on the train," he said. "Wanted to introduce myself. I'm Malfoy, Draco Malfoy." Ron made a sound that was barely a sound. Malfoy's attention snapped to Ron with the reflex of a boy who is accustomed to managing the room's social geometry from the center. "You'll find," he said, the cadence of a speech that had been prepared for an audience of one, "that some families in our world are better to be associated with than others." He looked back at Harry. "I can point you in the right direction, if you need it." Harry looked at him. He had the specific attention he used when the grid was telling him something he needed to understand, the quality of looking that was not dominant or submissive, but simply present, reading. What he read in Draco Malfoy was a boy who had been given a script and had rehearsed it carefully, and had arrived on the day of the performance to find that the audience was not responding to any of the cues. There was underneath the script something that was not yet fully formed, not malice exactly, not cruelty exactly, more the raw material of someone who has been told they are a specific shape and has never once been asked to verify it. Harry said nothing for the length of time it takes a train carriage to pass a signal post. Then Malfoy's eyes dropped to Harry's chest, the same involuntary refocus, the same instinctive attention to whatever the grid's ambient warmth did to the air around Harry. His expression changed, not to fear. The specific, younger uncertainty, the face underneath the script. His voice dropped out of the rehearsed register and became something more direct. "What is that?" The compartment lights breathed. There was no other word for it. The thin overhead strip cycled from white through gold to a deep red orange and back. A single slow pulse, 4 seconds, steady, deliberate, the specific rhythm of something very large and very calm expressing the fact of its existence. No wind, no sound. The lights simply breathed the grid's frequency into the visible spectrum and held it there for 4 seconds and released it. The warmth in the compartment went up 2 degrees. All 3 of Malfoy's carefully prepared expressions left his face at once. He was 11 years old for one unguarded moment, confronting something for which his script had not prepared him, and for which his upbringing had given him only the certainty that it should not exist. His companions took a step back. Malfoy took a step back. I don't know what you are, he said, and the honesty of it was surprising, not an accusation, not a challenge, just a genuine report from someone whose categories had just failed. I don't know what you are either, Harry said pleasantly. I'm sure we'll both figure it out. It was not a threat, it was not a dismissal. It was simply true, and it held the door open for something that might or might not happen years from now, depending on what Draco Malfoy decided to do with the raw material underneath his script, and Harry left it at that. Malfoy left. The door slid shut. The lights were ordinary white, and pretending to have always been ordinary white. Ron was looking at the overhead strips with his head tilted at an angle. Did you do that on purpose? No, Harry said. Could you have stopped it? Harry thought about it. Probably, if I'd been paying more attention. But you weren't paying attention because you were looking at Malfoy. Yes, so the lights were, what, expressing themselves, something like that. Ron looked at Hermione. Hermione had closed her book and was looking at Harry with an expression that was doing something between 3 and 5 separate things simultaneously and was trying to resolve them into an order of priority. She said, the Morphin Grid. Is that what you'd call it? Harry said. You know that name. She stopped, tapped the end of her pen against her notebook. I read something, a footnote. In a history of pre-Hogwarts magical traditions, there was a reference to a cosmological framework, pre-magical in origin, described as the foundational dimensional architecture of, but I dismissed it as speculative, because there was no primary source citation, and the footnote was only 11 words long, but now I'm thinking. You should find the primary source, Harry said. Yes, she said, with the certainty of someone who has already decided this and is just processing the confirmation. I'm going to need access to the restricted section, Ron said. We've been on the train for 2 hours. I know, Hermione said. We're not even at Hogwarts yet. I know that too, she said, and opened her notebook to a fresh page, and the pen began to move. Hogwarts appeared out of the dark water at the end of the boat, crossing like something that had always been there, and had simply been waiting for the appropriate angle of approach. It was lit from inside, its towers absolute against the September sky, and the light on the water moved with the boats and broke apart and reassembled in the wake of their passing. Harry sat in the front of the boat and looked at it, and the grid gave a long, slow pulse, not excitement, not awe, something more structural than either, recognition. The castle was in the right key. It had been built on a site where the grid ran close to the surface, where the dimensional architecture came up through the bedrock like groundwater, and every stone in the foundation had been placed with the knowledge of this, by people who had understood, 11 centuries ago, that you didn't build against this kind of frequency, you built with it. He looked at the towers and the light and the dark water, and felt the grid lean toward it the way a river leans toward the sea, with the patient certainty of something that knows where it's going. The Great Hall had a ceiling that had decided to be the sky, and had done so with complete conviction. Harry walked in with the other first years and felt 400 pairs of eyes process him from the moment he crossed the door. He was used to being looked at, had been looked at his whole life by people who couldn't explain what they were looking at, and he walked straight at his own pace and paid the attention back to the room rather than to the eyes. The 4 tables, the floating candles, the head table with its assembled faculty. Harry scanned it as he walked and found what he was looking for in approximately 3 seconds, the headmaster. Dumbledore was silver-haired and long-fingered, and looked like a man who had made patience into a physical discipline, and he sat at the center of the head table with an expression of composed, benevolent attention, and his hands were flat on the table in front of him. That was the detail, the hands, not clasped, not occupied with anything, not in his lap. Flat on the table, both of them, the specific stillness of hands that have been placed that way rather than settled there naturally, the deliberate quality of a man who has told his hands to stay. Harry noted it. Filed it in the new folder that was opening in his internal organization, the folder for things adults already knew and weren't saying, which was a folder that was going to need significant space. The sorting hat sang, the sorting began, names were called one by one and Harry waited. Potter Harry. The sound that went through the room was not a sound, technically. It was a particular quality of quiet that 400 people generate when they have stopped talking simultaneously, a silence with texture, the texture of attention. He walked to the stool, he sat. Professor McGonagall, standing to the left, lowered the hat onto his head. The darkness under the hat's brim was absolute, and then immediately not. There was a presence in it, a layered intelligence, the accumulated weight of 11,000 conversations conducted in this exact darkness over 9 centuries and some change. Oh, the hat said just that. Then it was quiet for a length of time that Harry counted by his own breathing, 5, 6, 7 seconds, the hall behind and below him going from curious quiet to a different quality of quiet, the silence of people noticing that the hat was taking much longer than usual. I've sorted 10,000 wizards, the hat said eventually. It's voiced the specific texture of something very old that has learned to be precise. I've sorted them by nature and tendency, by the notes their frequencies play, by the shapes their thinking makes under pressure. I have been unable to sort precisely 3 of them in 970 years. 2 were genuinely ambiguous. They carried conflicting notes in equal strength. The third, a pause. The third was sorted before I got there, centuries before, the hat said, by something I don't have a category for. What I am reading in you right now is not your nature the way I am usually permitted to read nature. What I am reading is a frequency, a bass note, something that doesn't belong in my taxonomy because it predates my taxonomy by several thousand years. Harry said in the private dark, I'd like Gryffindor. The hat was still for 2 breaths. You know, it said most students phrase it as a request. I'm being polite, Harry said. There's a difference. The hat made a sound that was not quite a laugh, something older, the sort of sound a document makes when it recognizes its own handwriting in an unexpected place. Gryffindor, it said, and then it said it again, out loud to the hall, Gryffindor. And the table on the far left erupted in the specific warmth of people who are genuinely pleased rather than obligated to be, and Harry lifted the hat off and set it on the stool and stood and went to the table. And as he moved, the grid breathed outward through the stone floor in a single slow pulse warm gold, moving from the stool in an expanding circle, reaching the walls and dissipating like a wave meeting a shore, leaving everything exactly as it had been but changed slightly in temperature. 4 seconds. Then it was gone. Harry sat beside Ron, who said, brilliant, mate, with the immediate enthusiasm of someone who had wanted this specific result and was not managing his reaction. Harry nodded. He looked at the head table. Dumbledore's expression was composed and benevolent and completely controlled. His hands were flat on the table. He was not reaching for anything, not for his goblet, not for the silverware, not for the small brass instrument Harry couldn't see at this distance, but which he registered was somewhere on the table's surface. Both hands flat, still, placed. The specific performance of a man keeping his hands where they are because keeping them where they are requires effort. Dumbledore's eyes met his across the great hall. Dumbledore inclined his head. The gesture was gracious and exact and told Harry nothing except what it was trying to conceal, which was itself significant. Harry inclined his head back. The grid ran warm in his chest, steady, even, the low gold hum he'd known in the cupboard on clear mornings, the warmth under the ribs that had always been there before he had a name for it, or a castle, or a table that wanted him at it. He took the goblet of pumpkin juice that appeared at his elbow. He drank. Ron said, I saved you a seat next to me in the dormitory. Well, I said I was saving you a seat. Dean thought that was odd because we just met, but that's just, thanks, Harry said. Ron looked at him and seemed to recognize that it was the right response. He looked back at the table and the food that was appearing and said, right, I'm starving, and reached for the potatoes. The dormitory was high in Gryffindor Tower, which was high in the castle, which was on a promontory above the lake, which was in Scotland. The specificity of its location pleased Harry in the same way precise measurements pleased him. There was comfort in knowing exactly where you were in the hierarchy of spaces. He stood at the window for a moment before unpacking, looking at the grounds in the dark, the lake's black surface, the forest's certain outline. Neville was arranging his things with the careful attention of someone who has been told, at some point, that arrangements could be revoked. Seamus and Dean were already in a conversation about Quidditch that had the easy rhythm of a conversation, resuming rather than beginning. Ron was eating the last pasty from the train. Harry unpacked his trunk. He did it slowly, which was the same pace he did most things, not sluggishly, but without the performative urgency of someone trying to demonstrate that they were settling in, being accepted, making themselves at home. He was simply doing the practical work of occupying a space. He put the books on the nightstand. He hung the robes on the hook. He set Hedwig's empty cage on the window ledge. She was out, hunting, the grid tracking her direction the way it tracked everything in his approximate radius, and smoothed the bedclothes and sat on the edge of the mattress and took stock. Ron, he said. Ron looked up from the pasty. Is it always like this? Harry gestured, which encompassed the room, the tower, the castle, the ceiling that had been the sky, Hogwarts. Ron thought about it genuinely, the forward lean of someone who takes questions seriously. I've never been, obviously. But my brothers said, Fred and George say it's always something, like you can't go a week without something happening that shouldn't have happened. And Bill said it's the best 7 years of his life. He ate the last bite of the pasty. Mum cried when she dropped me off this morning. That's usually a good sign. Harry thought about Mrs. Weasley crying, and the grid gave a very gentle tick, warmth, something almost domestic in the frequency, the register it occupied when it was doing the equivalent of nodding. Right, Harry said. He lay back on the mattress with his hands on his sternum. The grid ran through his palms. The dormitory settled into its sleeping sounds, Seamus and Dean's voices dropping, Neville's careful arranging complete. Ron went quiet in the steady way of someone who falls asleep without ceremony. Harry looked at the canopy above his bed. He thought about Ollivander's word, conduit, about the grid that had always been 3 inches below his sternum, running warm and constant through 11 years in a cupboard that was 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. He thought about the folder of things adults already knew and weren't saying, which now had Hagrid's careful silence, Ollivander's precise relief, McGonagall's watching from across the room, and Dumbledore's flat and deliberate hands. He thought about Ron with the pasties and Hermione with the notebook, and the way the compartment lights had breathed without being asked to. He had spent 11 years carrying something immense in a space 3 feet wide, in the dark, alone. He was beginning to understand, not as a thought, not yet, but as a frequency, the grid was running at the edges of his awareness, a new note that hadn't been in the register before tonight, that alone was not the same as necessary. That was not a comfortable understanding yet. It had sharp edges and unfamiliar weight, and he didn't trust it fully. But it was there the way the grid was there, present whether or not he was paying attention to it. He closed his eyes. The castle was old and very sure of itself, and the grid ran through its foundations the way it ran through his, old and foundational and patient and sure. He slept. Dumbledore's office was at the top of the moving staircase, and McGonagall climbed it at the pace of someone who has made a decision about what she is going to say and doesn't want the walk to complicate it. The door opened before she knocked. He was at the window. He had not turned the lights up. The room was in the low lamp glow that meant he'd been sitting in the dark before he heard her on the stairs. "He looked at your hands," she said from the door. He turned from the window. His expression was composed. His hands at his sides were deliberate. "I know," she came in. The fire was low, and the portraits were asleep in the way of portraits that were waiting to see what happened before committing to a position. On the corner of his desk, the small brass orrery turned its miniature planets in their slow ellipses, gold against the lamplight. "Pulse in the hall," she said, coming from the stool during the sorting. Albus. She sat without being invited, which was the register she used when she decided the conversation was not a consultation. "The bond is active, it's not latent. He's been living with it for 11 years and he's built a relationship with it, a working relationship in the dark, without guidance, without anyone telling him what it was. And now it's full amplitude and he's 11 and in our care." "In my care," Dumbledore said. "Which is exactly my concern," she said. He moved to the desk. He looked at the orrery without touching it. His face in profile was the face of a man adding something up and finding the sum more than he'd anticipated. "He's not what I expected." "No," she said. "He isn't frightened. He was watching me," Dumbledore said, which was not a complaint. It was observation, and there was something in it that was close to not admiration, not yet, but the preliminary stage of admiration, the moment when resistance begins to consider revising. "Precisely the detail I didn't want noticed. He noticed it in approximately 3 seconds, McGonagall said. Dumbledore sat. He opened the desk drawer and took out a journal, private, leather-bound, different from the administrative records he kept openly. He placed it on the desk. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took a quill from the stand. "What are you going to do?" McGonagall asked. "Observe," Dumbledore said. "Learn," and he paused. The quill moved, one line. "Reconsider some of my assumptions about what it means to manage something I cannot actually manage." He closed the journal. McGonagall looked at him for a moment that held several things she was not going to say tonight. Then she stood. "He's going to ask questions," she said. "Not at me, at the books first, then at me, then at you." "I know," Dumbledore said. "When he does, I'll answer them," he said. He looked at the orrery. "As honestly as the situation permits. As honestly as the situation," she stopped. "Albus, I want you to notice the size of the gap between honestly and as honestly as the situation permits." He was quiet. "He'll notice it too," she said. "Good night." She left. The door closed. The fire settled. Fawkes on his perch was the color of embers in the low light, and he made no sound, which was a comment, and Dumbledore heard it as one. The journal lay on the desk. If McGonagall had read the single line Dumbledore had written, it would have told her everything and nothing, which was itself a kind of honesty. It said, "The grid chose and the choosing was exact. The question I could not answer at Godric's Hollow, whether it chose a weapon or a person, has answered itself tonight, and the answer is worse than either option I had prepared for." He looked at the closed journal for a long time. Below in Gryffindor Tower, in the dormitory that smelled of heather and centuries of boys, Harry Potter lay on his back with his hands on his sternum, and the grid ran its warm, even frequency through his palms and through the mattress springs and through the old stone of the castle. And whatever Dumbledore had written, and whatever plans were already moving in rooms Harry had not yet visited, and whatever was waiting in the dark beyond the lake's far shore, none of it changed the frequency. It ran warm. It ran steady. It ran like a river that has always known where it's going. Chapter 2, Wands, Frequencies, and Why Snape Has That Look on His Face. The dungeon classroom smelled of stone, and something older than stone, the accumulated residue of 1,000 years of potions. Ingredients burned and combined and failed in the same room until the walls had absorbed it all and made it part of their character. The torches burned low because Snape preferred it that way, which was the first thing Harry understood about Snape before Snape said a word. A man who controls the light in his own room is telling you something about his relationship with scrutiny. Harry sat in the second row between Ron and Hermione. Hermione had arrived 7 minutes early and selected the position with the precision of someone who had already mapped the room in her mind. Central sight line to the board, far enough back that engagement wouldn't read as sycophancy, close enough that the notes would be legible. She had 2 quills pre-dipped, arranged at parallel angles on her desk. She had the textbook open to Chapter 1, and the supplementary text she'd brought from home tucked underneath it at an angle that suggested she'd done this before and knew exactly which angle was least detectable. Ron was drawing in the margin of his parchment. Harry glanced at it, a knight on horseback, rendered with quiet precision, the horse mid-stride. Ron drew the way people draw when they've spent years watching someone create things by hand, his father with muggle objects, his mother with needles and thread, absorbing the discipline of making without being taught it formally. Harry looked at the drawing and said nothing, and Ron didn't offer anything, and the silence between them had the easy quality of people who have spent enough time together to have established what needs saying and what doesn't, 3 weeks in. That was the honest accounting, 3 weeks since the train and the compartment lights and the great hall and the grid's pulse moving across the stone floor. 3 weeks since Harry had unpacked his trunk with deliberate slowness and lay in the dormitory, feeling the shape of something new, the not alone shape, which had sharp edges still, and which he was learning by careful degrees. He and Ron had established their communication style through the empirical method. Try a thing, see if it resonated, keep what worked. The empirical method had determined that Ron required a direct question rather than an implication, preferred to be asked about his family rather than his feelings, and responded to honesty with more honesty, which was the most useful quality Harry had encountered in another person. Hermione had been a faster study in the sense that she operated on the surface. Everything she was thinking was available if you watched the right signals. The speed of her writing, whether the pen was moving in the margin or the line page, the number of subordinate clauses per sentence. In 3 weeks, Harry had learned her anxious frequency and her engaged frequency and the specific signal of I have found something and have not decided yet whether to tell you, which was the notebook open at a 45-degree angle and the pen going still. The notebook was at a 45-degree angle right now. Harry looked at it and then at the door. Snape arrived. He came through the door the way certain weather comes through a door, with the quality of a system that fills available space rather than occupying a portion of it, the black robes settling around him as though they had rehearsed the entrance. Harry had attended enough of his classes to have established Snape's register already, the voice that was pitched just below where it needed to be comfortable, the silences used architecturally, the way he moved through the rows of work tables, as though verifying that the room was correctly arranged. He never leaned. He never gestured broadly. He contained himself into the minimum space required for whatever he was doing, which was the body language of a man who has decided some time ago that expansion is a form of vulnerability. He took the register. He reached Harry's name and did not look up. "Our new celebrity," he said, in the voice he used for making observations from which he'd removed all inflection, so the observation arrived in the listener's mind unaccompanied by context and therefore more uncomfortable. "Potter," he let the name sit. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormhood?" The question had a function. Harry had identified the function the moment he'd heard the preamble, our new celebrity being the tell, which was to establish a dynamic in front of 30 students. Snape as authority, Harry as the famous name that couldn't actually perform. It was a reasonable opening gambit. It was also transparently tactical, which made answering it directly a kind of capitulation. He said, "Draft of Living Death, Chapter 3. He kept his voice level. "But I think you already knew that, so I'm not sure the question was actually about the potion." The room went quiet with the specific quality of 30 people simultaneously deciding not to move. Snape's expression did not change. The not changing was itself a change, a kind of internal recalibration happening behind a held face, the specific effort of a man choosing, in real time, not to react visibly to something that merited a reaction. His eyes moved to Harry's chest, briefly, with the involuntary quality of a reflex rather than an intention. They moved away. Harry filed that. The look was the third iteration he'd collected. Vernon's look was the look of a man confronting the inexplicable and finding it repulsive. Ollivander's was the craftsman's recognition, full of technical appreciation. What Snape's look held was different from both. It was the look of a man seeing a reference document made physical, the specific unease of someone whose knowledge of a subject has always been academic and who is now sitting in the same room as the subject. It held recognition and something that lived adjacent to alarm, and it was gone in under 2 seconds, replaced by the surface expression of a man who had decided to table the question. 5 points from Gryffindor, Snape said, moving on. For the unsolicited observation, he looked at the register. Longbottom, the Bezoar location. Neville went pale. Harry looked at Neville, who was sitting in the row ahead to the left, and who was currently having a very private internal conflict between the knowledge of the answer. Harry had seen him reading the chapter on the train from London, and the specific paralysis that came from being looked at by an authority who expected failure. His pen was touching the parchment without moving. His knuckles had gone white around it. Harry said, quietly, just for Neville, stomach of a goat. Hermione simultaneously said the same thing at full volume, because Hermione had also seen the conflict and had decided that full volume was the appropriate intervention. She continued because having started she was not going to stop, through the Bezoar's antidote properties and its limitations, and the chemical reasoning behind the limitations, all delivered at the speed of someone who is nervous and using precision as ballast. Snape let her finish. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that Harry was beginning to understand was Snape's version of reluctant respect, something that showed up in the slight quality of the silence before he spoke, a beat that was not dismissal. "That will do, Miss Granger," he said. He returned to the register and Harry caught, in that fractional pause, something else. Snape had looked at the two of them, Harry and Hermione, the overlapping response, with an expression that wasn't evaluating them individually but together, as a unit, as though the existence of a unit was the information he was processing. The potions lesson was theory for the first 40 minutes and practical for the last 20. The practical was a simple preparatory brew, a base solution that would be used in the following week's class. Harry worked methodically, reading the instructions once and then following them with the economy of someone who doesn't need to check his work because his work tracks. The grid had an opinion about potions, which was a positive one. The subject had the same structural logic as frequency work, the same premise that specific inputs in specific proportions at specific temperatures produce specific outputs, that there was no room for approximation and no appeal from the results. Harry respected that. His potion came out right. It also came out a color that was not in the instructions. The prescribed result was pale lavender. Harry's was deep blue-violet, almost indigo, with a faint luminescence that moved within the liquid in slow spirals. He looked at it. The grid was doing it, running its frequency through the potion's molecular structure, the way it ran through everything he touched, the warmth affecting the chemistry at a level the instructions hadn't accounted for because the instructions had been written for people who were not conduits for the foundational frequency of dimensional reality. He considered adding a cold water correction, decided against it. The chemistry was right. The color was an artifact, not an error. Snape arrived at his cauldron in his circuit of the room and stopped. He looked at the potion for 3 full seconds. His expression held a very specific internal argument, which Harry watched without attempting to read. It was private, whatever was happening behind that face, and it was being resolved into the neutral surface quickly and competently. He wrote something in the register. He moved on. He did not take points. He did not comment. He moved on to Neville's cauldron, which had produced something that was technically lavender, if lavender could be described as a cloudy brown, and the comment there was detailed and delivered in a voice that had a specific sharp edge. Harry looked at Neville's shoulders, moving up around his ears, and noted it in the same folder as everything else that was building. After class in the corridor, Hermione said, "Your potion was the wrong color, wrong shade of the right reaction," Harry said. "That's not how the grading criteria work. He didn't take points." She considered this. "No," she said, "he didn't." She looked at him with the notebook at 45 degrees expression. "He knew what it meant, didn't he? The color." "Something like that," Harry said. She opened her notebook. Charms was Flitwick, who was a small man in a precise way, not diminished by his size, but organized within it, moving with the efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with his dimensions and found them perfectly functional. He taught with his whole body, demonstrating wand movements with his right hand and conducting the class's attention with his left, and he had the quality of a man whose enthusiasm for his subject had aged from passion into something more sustainable, a deep structural pleasure that showed up in the way he talked about even the most basic spells, as though there was nothing about magic that wasn't interesting. He demonstrated Wingardium Leviosa with the correct gravity, making the distinction between swish and flick with its due weight. He set the class to practice. Harry had his feather in front of him and his wand in his hand, and the grid warm and available in his chest, and the first try sent the feather to approximately 4 feet and held it there, and would have kept going if Harry hadn't immediately begun the work of throttling back, reading the feather's trajectory through the grid's spatial awareness, and bringing it down by reducing the frequency output 1 incremental degree at a time. 4 feet became 3, 3 became 2. He was working backward, finding the minimum translation, how much grid frequency through how much wand at what angle produced one correctly levitating feather at the appropriate height. It was engineering, essentially. Beside him, Ron's feather was twitching. It was rotating in place about a 1/4 inch off the desk, which was the right direction if not the right elevation, and Ron was attempting the wand movement with the dogged repetition of someone who has been told he's not naturally suited to this and is choosing to treat that as a challenge rather than a conclusion. Across the room, Hermione's feather had been in the air for 40 seconds, which Harry had clocked with the internal counter the grid gave him for temporal distance from a given starting point, the same way it gave him spatial maps and frequency readings. She was holding it with complete steadiness, and had been for the entire 40 seconds, and she looked at it with the expression of someone verifying a hypothesis rather than watching a miracle. Harry looked at Ron's feather. He watched Ron's wrist. The movement was right directionally, but the angle at the wrist break was a few degrees off, sending the force sideways rather than up. He leaned over and touched the back of Ron's wrist with 2 fingers, not gripping, just indicating the adjustment point. Ron felt it and corrected, and the feather went up. "Oh," Ron said at the feather. "Wrist angle," Harry said. "Right." Ron kept it in the air with the specific concentration of someone who has found the correct motion and is memorizing it through the muscle before the muscle has it on its own. "How'd you know what was wrong from watching?" "The grid reads spatial trajectories," Harry said. "I can see where the force was going." Ron glanced at him with the expression Harry had started to think of as Ron's update face, the forward tilt of someone receiving new information and immediately integrating it rather than queuing it for later review. "Can you do that for chess?" "Probably," Harry said. Ron went back to his feather with an expression that was calculating something much longer range than the current lesson. Flitwick appeared at Harry's elbow, moving with the light-footed speed that Harry was beginning to recognize as his characteristic mode. He looked at Harry's feather, which was currently at a precise 18 inches and going nowhere, and his expression did the thing it had done the first lesson, the slight recalibration, the sharpening of attention, the expression of a teacher whose grading curve has been presented with an anomalous data point. "You're not trying to lift it," Flitwick said, "not accusation, observation. I'm trying to lift it exactly the right amount," Harry said. "The right amount being 1 feather at the prescribed height with the minimum output required." Harry paused. "Otherwise things get complicated." Flitwick looked at the feather for a moment, then at Harry, then at the feather again. He made the note on his separate parchment, the one that was not the class register, with the careful precision of someone documenting something for a specific later purpose. He didn't say what the purpose was. He moved on, but he paused at the door at the end of class, just briefly, and looked back at Harry's bench with an expression that had moved past academic interest into something more specific, the expression of a man who has heard a name in a secondary context and is now revising the primary source. Transfiguration established a different set of rules. McGonagall began as a cat, which was how she always began, the specific pedagogical effect of demonstrating on day 1 that the gap between teacher and student was not a matter of degree but of kind, that she existed in this subject at a level they had not yet conceived of. The transformation from cat to professor happened in one motion that Harry watched with the grid's full attention, reading the frequency shift, the specific reconfiguration of the magical field, as one physical organization resolved into another. It was extraordinary. Not because of the result, but because of the method, the total commitment of the transformation, no hedging, no partial states, the thing done completely or not at all. He understood why she was the teacher of this subject. She thought about it the way it needed to be thought about. She lectured. She was precise about the danger. She set them to the matchstick to needle work with the assessment of someone who expected, realistically, 1 success in the class and considered that a good lesson. Harry's matchstick became a needle in approximately 2 seconds, and then the grid overran the transfiguration's parameters, which was what happened when you put a river through a keyhole and forgot to close the upstream channel. The needle resolved upward through its own form, shedding the prescribed result for something the magic seemed to prefer, 3 inches of cold, bright metal with edges that were perfect in the way that things are perfect when a process runs all the way to completion without a corrective hand. A miniature sword, very still, very exact. He pulled back. The metal moved backward through its own states. Sword became needle, became matchstick. He looked at it on his desk. The matchstick was slightly warm. McGonagall was looking at him from the front of the room. He knew because the grid had given him her position and the direction of her attention in the same moment, he'd looked down at the matchstick. He did the exercise again. Clean needle, correct size, held at the appropriate level of completion. He felt her exhale from 15 feet away. After class, the corridor. Potter. Her voice had the brisk quality of someone who has 2 minutes and intends to use them precisely. The other students filed past. Ron looked a question at Harry, and Harry tilted his head toward the door. "Go on, I'll catch you," and Ron went, taking a biscuit from his bag as he went, which was his version of the same gesture. McGonagall sat at her desk and folded her hands and looked at Harry with the directness that was her default register when the situation didn't require any other. "You've been managing it," she said. "Yes, Professor." "Since when?" "Always," Harry said. "I just know it better now than I did before." She was quiet for the length of time it takes a complicated thought to become a simple question. "Are you well?" she said, and it was not the administrative version of the question. It was the version that meant, "I am asking as a person, not a role." Harry looked at her steadily. McGonagall had an honesty about her that he'd found consistently useful. She said what she thought, which not everyone did, and when she didn't say what she thought, it was because she'd made a principled decision not to, which was different from not knowing it. "Yes," he said, which was true. "Is there something you want to tell me?" She looked at him. The pause had a specific quality, not evasive, not uncomfortable, but the pause of someone who has arrived at a fork and is determining which path was actually theirs to walk. "Come to me if you have concerns," she said. "For anything, any concern." "You said that already," Harry said. "At the beginning of term. I'm saying it again," she said, "because I want you to know I mean it more now than I did then." She looked at her hands for a moment and then back at him. "I don't always know everything that I ought to know," she said, which was a careful sentence, and Harry heard the precision of it. "But what I told you, come to me, that is entirely mine to offer, and I mean it entirely." Harry said, "Thank you, Professor." He meant it. He left. In the corridor, the grid gave a steady, even warmth that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the accumulating evidence that this was a place where people were, at least sometimes, trying to do the right thing by him. He was learning to receive that without either discounting it or weighting it more than it could bear. Both errors were available, and he was watching for both. Flying lessons were on a Tuesday morning, with a sky that had gone flat and gray and practical, the weather of a country that has decided to get on with things rather than make a show of them. Madame Hooch had the manner of a person who has taught children to fly for decades and has developed a comprehensive taxonomy of the errors available to a first-year student and a specific protocol for each. Harry had his broom in front of him, school broom, standard issue, maintained for function rather than performance, the magical equivalent of a vehicle that has been driven by 100 different people and remembers all of them faintly. Put his right hand over it. The broom came up before he'd finished the motion, not because he'd spoken to it or directed it specifically. The grid had read the broom's enchantment in the same way it read the wand's, as a working structure it could interface with, a system it could enter a dialogue with, and the broom had simply responded to the conversation, coming up with the cooperation of something that had been waiting for someone to actually hear it rather than just command it. Hooch looked at his broom and looked at him with the sharp assessment of a teacher recalibrating a default assumption. She said nothing. She moved on to Neville, whose broom was attempting to rise and creating a quality of gravitational ambiguity that was making everyone in the immediate vicinity uneasy. They mounted. They waited. Hooch walked the line. Draco Malfoy, 3 positions to Harry's right, was performing his broom mounting the way he performed most things, with the awareness of being watched layered over the actual activity, so that the mounting was simultaneously functional and a display of the mounting's facility. Harry had noticed, a genuine aptitude for this. The performance and the skill were both real. The problem was that he couldn't distinguish between them, which meant he couldn't tell which one people were responding to at any given moment. Neville's remembrall was on the ground, set there when his broom had briefly achieved enough lift to require both hands. It was glass and red and caught the flat gray light of the morning. Harry registered it with the grid's spatial awareness the same way he registered all objects in his radius, position, mass, the faint magical signature of a memory charm, the specific warmth of something recently handled. Hooch turned away to correct someone's grip. Draco reached down and took the remembrall off the ground. Harry had known he was going to do it. The grid's spatial reading had given him Draco's trajectory, the lane, the arm extension, the specific intention of the motion, 3 seconds before completion. He had not prevented it. He was doing what he always did when he read intention before action. He waited to see if the action was worth addressing. Draco held it up. He said something to Neville with the delivery of someone who has selected a cruelty, and is now delivering it efficiently, the way you deliver a prepared remark, rather than discovering a thought in real time. Neville looked at his hands. Harry did not chase the remembrall. Brought his broom mount back to parade rest, his hand, and he opened his palm and waited, and the grid read the remembrall's position in three-dimensional space with the same precision it read chess pieces and feathers and the molecular chemistry of a potion's brew. And it pulled not hard, not loudly, just the gravitational lean that was its default mode of interaction with the physical world, and the remembrall left Draco's grip in a clean arc, 30 feet of it, and settled into Harry's open hand. The feeling was neither triumph nor show. It was simply the correct application of the tool available. Neville made a sound that was not a word. Ron said under his breath, "Oh, that's going to be a thing," which was accurate. Draco looked at his empty hand. His expression moved through several states quickly, landing eventually on something that was working hard to look like contempt, but had underneath it a second layer that was almost identical to the expression he'd had in the train compartment when the lights breathed, the face underneath the script, the younger and more honest version, encountering something it did not have a framework for. Harry held the remembrall out to Neville without ceremony. Neville took it. He was looking at Harry with an expression that Harry had not been prepared for. It was gratitude, yes, but it was the specific kind of gratitude that comes from being defended by someone who did not make a production of the defense, which is a different and more careful gift than the kind that requires witnessing. "Thank you," Neville said, at a volume meant for Harry and not the audience. "Don't leave things on the ground around him," Harry said, which was practical advice rather than comfort, and Neville's mouth moved in a small curve that was the first unguarded expression Harry had seen from him. From a first-floor window in the castle, McGonagall watched all of this with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. She had a cup of tea in her hand that she had stopped lifting to her mouth. She held it there for 3 seconds after the remembrall landed in Harry's palm, then set it on the windowsill. Then she turned from the window and walked at speed toward a specific staircase. Dumbledore's office had the atmosphere of a room that has been continuously occupied by one strong personality for a long time, not oppressively, but pervasively, the way a garden bears the character of its gardener, even in the gardener's absence. The instruments made no sound, but occupied their surfaces with conviction. The portraits slept. Fawkes was on his perch with the warm, ember quality he had in the afternoons, not fully burning, conserving. McGonagall came in without knocking. This was one of a small number of established permissions. Dumbledore was at the desk. The orrery turned on its corner. His hands were in his lap. He recalled the remembrall from 30 feet, McGonagall said. No wand, no incantation, in front of the entire first-year flying class in Hooch. "Yes," Dumbledore said, "you knew about the incident." "I have ways of knowing things," he said, which was true but was also, she noted, not exactly the answer to her statement. She sat without invitation. His wand was on his broom's handle. He didn't reach for it, he opened his hand. "The wand is a translation tool," Dumbledore said. He was looking at the orrery. The gold planets turned in their ellipses, the whole system maintaining its distances. He wouldn't need it for basic spatial influence. The grid's gravitational capacity at his level of acclimation. He paused on the word as though it was not the word he'd wanted, but the most accurate one available. He's been doing this since he was old enough to reach for objects. The Dursleys' records show a number of incidents they described as unnatural. Broken objects returning to shelves, locks opening. Things arriving in his hands from across rooms. He paused again. He was probably 5 or 6 when it started being directed rather than ambient. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. The fire was lower than usual. Fawkes was still. He was 5 or 6, she said, very carefully, and already developing navigational use of the grid, in a house where any display of the unusual was punished. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Albus," she said and stopped. He looked at her. His expression was the composed one, the surface. But his hands, she noticed, were in his lap and not on the desk, and the specific quality of their stillness there, not placed, not deliberate, just in his lap, was the expression of a man who was not performing composure but genuinely sitting with something. "The plan for Voldemort's return," she said, not asking. "The necessity of his preparation. I understand all of it. I understood it at Godric's Hollow and I understand it now." She paused. "What I need you to understand is that there is a gap between necessary and decided without him, and that gap is currently the size of 11 years, and he knows it exists." Dumbledore was quiet. "He watches your hands," she said. He noticed them in the first 30 seconds in the Great Hall. He noticed the grid's information about you, about what you were feeling, and he tracked it through your hands. He's been doing this all his life with the Dursleys, reading what people can't suppress even when they control their faces. She stood. "He is not going to be manageable the way you've planned for. He's not going to be surprised by things he's been given time to feel coming. And he is," she paused, "he is already building a file on what you know and haven't told him." Dumbledore's eyes moved to her face. His expression changed just slightly, just at the edges, the composed surface admitting something more specific. "He told you that, not in those words," she said. "He implied it in the structure of how he asked me questions. He asks what he doesn't know. He doesn't ask about what he does know. When I offered him information about his own welfare, he turned it directly into a question about whether I had information for him." She paused. "He is mapping the room, Albus, and you are in the room." Dumbledore looked at the orrery for a long time. "Bring him in at the right moment," McGonagall said. "Not the strategic moment, the right one." She left. Dumbledore sat. Fawkes looked at him from the perch with the flame-steady attention of a bird that has witnessed several centuries of human decision-making and has developed opinions. Dumbledore reached for the orrery. His hand moved toward it, the fingers extending, and then he stopped the motion before completion and pulled his hand back to his lap. The first time Harry felt the Quirrell frequency, it was a Thursday. He was going from the library to the common room via the third-floor corridor, which was not the most direct route, but which the grid had been quietly orienting him toward for a week, the way it oriented toward things it wanted him to examine. Not urgently, patiently. The grid was always patient. It had existed since before language. It had time, but it had a way of being patient in a direction, and the direction lately was the third floor. He had been walking past the door at the corridor's end twice a day, reading the frequency through the stone. There was something behind the door that resonated with the grid, resonated at it, specifically, the way a frequency probe resonates at a signal it's trying to locate, something with awareness. Something that knew the grid was there. He was thinking about this, the specific quality of being aware versus being a frequency, and what it implied about the thing behind the door, when Quirrell came around the corner from the direction of the forbidden corridor, moving with his characteristic shuffle lean, the turban enormous and white above his robes. The grid lunged. There was no other word for it. It didn't shudder. It didn't tick. It moved like something that has been standing very still and has encountered, suddenly, the source of the reason for the stillness. Dissonance was not a subtle frequency mismatch. It was the specific sound of a signal that has been designed to interface with the grid's wavelength and has been doing so nearby for months, and which the grid found not threatening exactly but wrong in the way that a wrong note in a familiar piece of music is wrong, audible immediately, structurally disruptive. Harry stopped walking. Quirrell stopped too. His eyes found Harry with the practiced, apologetic focus of a man who had made a career of appearing harmless and had become very good at it. "Peapotter," he said, the stutter arriving on schedule. "Off somewhere." Harry looked at Quirrell and the grid read him. The surface was the stutter, the apologetic lean, the nervous eyes, the turban. The grid read past the surface the way it read past surfaces, using the frequency signature rather than the visual evidence, and what it found behind Quirrell's surface was a signal, not Quirrell's signal, not coming from Quirrell's frequency, coming from behind him. Not behind him spatially, behind him in the way a shadow is behind its object, a secondary presence riding the primary, a frequency that was trying to be very quiet and was not quite succeeding, because quiet was a relative term when the thing you were being quiet next to was a nexus that heard everything. "Library," Harry said. "You all right, Professor?" Fine, fine," Quirrell said, and smiled with the eyes of a man whose smile was a tool and went around Harry and down the corridor. Harry stood and listened to the footsteps recede and let the grid run the signal analysis it had begun, tracing the frequency back, the dissonance, the probe quality of it, the specific angle of its interference with the grid's wavelength. It was not random interference. It was not ambient wrong frequency from a damaged charm or a cursed object or old dark magic in the walls. It was targeted. It was reading the grid the way you read something you want to understand before you try to take it. He turned and walked toward the library, keeping his pace even and his expression unremarkable. In the library, Ron and Hermione were at their table in the back corner, which had become their table by the combination of Hermione's consistent early arrival and Ron's willingness to save the adjacent seats, a territorial claim established through presence rather than confrontation. Hermione had 3 books open in the specific overlapping arrangement of someone reading multiple sources simultaneously, cross-referencing in real time. Ron was eating and reading a Quidditch Weekly. Harry sat down and told them about the corridor in 4 sentences. Ron said, "It's the turban." Hermione said, "That is not a supported hypothesis," and she was already pulling one of the open books toward her, finding a page, running her finger down an index. "It wasn't the turban," Harry said. "It's something behind Quirrell, using him, riding his frequency the way a harmonic rides a fundamental tone." Hermione looked up. "A secondary presence, using his body as a container," Harry said. "And it's been near the grid since before September. The frequency signature has the quality of something that's been in the same building for months. Quirrell started at Hogwarts this year," Hermione said, and her voice had picked up the specific speed of her thinking aloud mode when the analysis ran faster than the social editing. "He was gone for a year, the whole of last year, on what was described as a sabbatical to study first-hand accounts of dark creatures, which is in his ministry file, which I found in the library's archive of faculty appointments, because there's a legal requirement to keep them on record. She found the page. And when he came back, he was different. Everyone who knew him before says he was different. Nervous, which he wasn't before. The turban, which he didn't wear before. She paused. He went somewhere that something got onto him. Something that wanted to get back here, Harry said. To what? Ron said, which was the right question, and he asked it with the directness of someone who had been following the thread and had arrived at the same place. Harry and Hermione looked at each other across the table. The third-floor corridor, they said, at the same time, which made Ron point at them both in the way of someone witnessing a phenomenon. Hermione reached for the second book. Professor Dumbledore specifically restricted the right-hand side of the third-floor corridor, not the left, not both directions, the right, which is directional, which means the restriction is spatial rather than general, which means what's there is in a specific location. She was already writing. And someone has moved something to Hogwarts for safekeeping, something important enough to justify specific spatial restriction in the school's primary safety announcement, something that a secondary presence inside a professor would want, Harry said. Ron set down his Quidditch weakly. He looked between them. Right, he said, with the specific tone of someone who has caught up with a fast-moving situation and is integrating it with complete seriousness. So what do we do? More information, Hermione said immediately. We find out what's behind that door before we consider anything operational. Agreed, Harry said. Ron reached into his bag and distributed a biscuit to each of them without comment, which was his version of "we're in this together," and which served the same function. Halloween arrived with smoke and pumpkins, and the specific quality of festivity that Hogwarts brought to its calendar events, enormous, confident, entirely committed to the aesthetic. The Great Hall was theatrical. The food was extraordinary. Harry ate and watched the candles and felt the grid running its usual read on the room's ambient frequency, noting the concentrated magic of the feast, the specific resonance of 400 magical signatures in one enclosed space. He noticed from the texture of the grid's read that Quirrell's signal was louder tonight. It was the same wrong frequency, the same probendride quality he'd identified in the corridor, but the volume had increased, a sustained interference rather than the low background hum it usually maintained. He looked at Quirrell at the head table. Quirrell was eating. His expression was the nervous default. His eyes were moving, though, in a specific pattern that was not the random attention of a man watching a room, but the systematic attention of someone scanning for something. Scanning for the grid's nexus, for Harry specifically, looking for the position of the frequency source the secondary presence had been tracking. Harry returned his attention to his plate and noted this without reacting and thought. Soon, Quirrell stood up. He pushed back from his chair with an expression that had shifted. The nervous surface was still there, but underneath it was a kind of commitment that read differently from everything Harry had seen from him. He walked to the center of the hall, which required walking away from his seat and away from the exits, which was not the walk of a man planning to run. He screamed. The Troll in the Dungeon's announcement was delivered with enough theatrical conviction that Harry, reading the secondary presence's signal through Quirrell's body, understood it was genuine. The troll was real. The crisis was real, even if the hand behind it was managing the crisis toward a specific outcome. The hall dissolved into controlled panic. Prefects moved. Heads of houses moved. The specific machinery of Hogwarts emergency protocol engaged. Harry was already thinking about who wasn't in the hall, Hermione. She had not been at dinner. She'd been in the bathroom on the third floor since lunchtime. Harry knew this through the grid's ambient read, the sense of where the people in his close radius, or the way a musician hears the ensemble around their own instrument. He had been thinking he'd see her at dinner. She hadn't arrived. He looked at Ron. Ron was already looking at him. "She's not here," Ron said. "Third floor," Harry said. They were up and moving while the hall was still reorganizing, going against the outbound current with the grid's spatial priority clearing their path, not aggressively, just the sense of pressure in the direction of their movement that made people step aside the way water moves around a stone, instinctively, without quite knowing why. The third-floor corridor was empty. The bathroom door was ajar. The smell arrived before they did, the specific olfactory statement of a 12-foot troll in an enclosed space, a smell that did not share any characteristics with anything pleasant. Harry pushed the door open. The troll was at the far wall and it was enormous, not in the way that Hagrid was enormous. Hagrid was enormous with warmth, enormous with presence, enormous in a direction you could walk toward, but enormous in the way of something that had been built without any consideration of the rooms it would occupy. It had a club that it was using to explain its feelings about the wall. Between swings, the wall was winning on points but would not be for much longer. Hermione was behind the sink bank to the right, flat against it, knees up, occupying the minimum possible space while maintaining complete situational awareness. She had tracked the troll's pattern. She had identified the door. She had made a plan and the plan required someone to come through the door to execute, and the plan was currently executing as designed, which Harry could see from the quality of her attention, focused, not frozen, the difference between a person who is afraid and a person who is operating inside fear rather than being stopped by it. She saw Harry and Ron. Something in her face shifted, the plan upgrading from possible to in motion. Ron was raising his wand. Harry was already past the threshold. He moved to the center of the room, the spatial center, the point from which the grid's read on the available volume was most complete, and stood there. He did not raise his wand. He did not shout. He set his feet at shoulder width and breathed in once, reading the troll's spatial sense through the grid's gravitational awareness, finding the architecture of the creature's perception. The troll's brain was simple and functional, and not much more, operating on the premise that the world was divided into things that are here and things that are not here, with occasional subcategories for things that are here and annoying. Spatial sense was strong, the navigational confidence of something that had never needed to be subtle about where it was going. Harry located the sense, found its frequency, the specific quality of a perception system, and the grid bracketed it, not a wall, not a force. Field of interference, the way certain electrical frequencies disturb magnetic navigation. The troll's spatial sense received data. The grid modified the data. Not dramatically, the troll was still in the room, still held a club, still had opinions about existence. But the data about where the exits were and where the threats were, and in which direction the room made sense had been subtly, thoroughly adjusted. The troll swung its club at a wall that it had become momentarily convinced was a different wall. It turned. It took 3 steps in a direction that its brain was reporting as correct and which was not. It stopped. Its great head swung. It made a sound that was confusion rather than aggression, which was a different register, and in the 12 seconds of confusion, Hermione moved. She came out from behind the sink bank on the path she'd planned, 3 strides that were clean and quick and completely committed, crossing the open floor to Harry's left. She stopped beside him. She looked at the troll, which was still swinging its head, still recalibrating, still in the disorientation the grid was maintaining, with the focused ease of something that found a 12-foot troll's navigational system, an extremely low-bandwidth application. Ron in the doorway had his wand up, and his face set in the expression of someone who will do what needs doing when the moment arrives. The moment didn't arrive. McGonagall arrived instead, through the door 10 seconds after Hermione reached Harry's side, with Snape 2 steps behind her and Quirrell 3 steps behind him. McGonagall took in the room, Harry in the center, Hermione beside him, the troll in deep spatial confusion, the ceiling intact, the walls mostly intact, no blood, with the fast, comprehensive assessment of a woman who has been managing crises for a very long time. She and Snape handled the troll in under 30 seconds. It was efficient and considerably less interesting than what had preceded it. Then McGonagall turned to them. The address that followed was comprehensive and fair. Harry let it land, which was the right response. They had left the house area during an emergency, regardless of the reason, and the statement of that fact was warranted. Hermione was issued 5 points for presence of mind in a difficult situation, which made Ron raise both eyebrows in the direction of the distribution logic, but say nothing. McGonagall looked at Harry. "How did you keep it disoriented?" she said. "Spatial interference," Harry said. "The grid generates a field that disrupts basic navigational perception. I targeted the troll's spatial sense specifically. No wand involved. No, Professor." She looked at the center of the room where Harry had been standing. The stone floor was unmarked. The grid left no residue. It was a frequency, not a substance, and when it withdrew completely. There was nothing to examine. She looked back at Harry, and her expression had the same quality it had had in the Transfiguration classroom. Not a teacher evaluating a student, something more direct than that, an adult taking the measure of someone who was turning out to be considerably more than the frame around the measurement. "Both of you," she said. "Common room." Harry moved for the door. As he passed Snape, he was aware of Snape's attention as a specific pressure, not the visual kind, not a look, but the grid's reading of where Snape's focus was directed, and Snape's focus was directed at the floor of the room behind Harry. At the center point, at where Harry had been standing, Harry did not turn around. He heard, in the quality of Snape's silence behind him, the sound of a man who has just read something in a primary source that revised a long-standing secondary source assumption and is sitting with the implications. The silence had an internal argument in it. He filed the argument under Snape knows something, and what Snape knows is changing shape. Quirrell was looking at Harry from the doorway with an expression that was not the nervous default. It lasted less than a second before the nervous default reasserted, but Harry had already read it, the measuring quality, the specific attention of something that had been tracking a frequency and had just received a stronger signal than expected. The secondary presence behind Quirrell's eyes was recalibrating. It was revising its assessment of the target. Harry walked past him into the corridor and did not let his pace change. Saturday morning. Library back corner. Hermione's table, with Hermione's 3-book arrangement and her annotated notebook, and the specific morning light that came through the high windows at that angle in late October, illuminating the dust between the shelves in long bars of gold. She pushed a book across the table. It was the most carefully pushed book Harry had ever received, the gesture of a person who has been waiting to make it, who has rehearsed the approach until it was exactly the right tempo. The book was old in a way that had nothing to do with handling. It was old in the way of something that had been old when people who were now old were not yet born. The cover was plain stone gray with no title. The spine had once had lettering that had given up. She had it open to a page near the back. The diagram filled the page. Harry looked at it, the grid responded. It was not a dramatic response, not a pulse, not a warmth spike, not a spatial event. It was recognition, the specific frequency shift that happened when the grid encountered something that was made of it, information encoded in its own language. The diagram was a cross-section of the grid's dimensional architecture, rendered in ink 3,000 years old by someone who had understood it from the inside, and the grid recognized its own cartography. Harry looked at the central point of the diagram, the nexus, the junction, the 7 symbols arranged around the circle with their cross, and the grid played each of the 7 symbols like keys, a chord from a keyboard he hadn't known he had, and the chord rang through him from sternum to spine and settled. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Restricted section," Hermione said. "I told Madame Pince I was conducting independent research on pre-Hogwarts cosmological frameworks for extra credit. She gave me a conditional pass." She paused. "The condition was that I didn't touch the books that bleed, which I had no intention of touching in any case." Ron said, doesn't it look like the thing you do?" He was pointing at the central diagram, at the pattern of radiating lines from the nexus point. That pattern. "When you in the bathroom, when you were standing in the center of the room, there was a moment where I could see it, like heat. Not actual light, but like looking at summer tarmac, and it was that shape." Harry looked at Ron. "You saw it, just for a second," Ron said, which he said with complete matter-of-factness, as though briefly seeing the foundational architecture of dimensional reality was a minor peripheral detail of his Thursday evening rather than a significant event. "You might be particularly attuned to the grid's visual spectrum," Hermione said, making a note. "That would fit with your families. The Weasley family has been magical for," she counted in her head. "Several hundred years of concentrated magical lineage. Certain frequency sensitivities could be." "Hermione," Ron said. "Yes, the book." She found her place. She had translated the relevant passage twice. Harry could tell from the 2 sets of handwriting on the notes tucked into the page, a first pass in her regular hand, and a second pass in a smaller, more precise hand that indicated revision. "The nexus," she read, "occurs at the junctions of the grid's dimensional architecture, when the accumulated coherence of the frequency demands a material anchor, a physical point in 3-dimensional reality through which the grid can maintain the stability of the dimensional membrane." She looked up. "Which in practice means the grid needs somewhere to be," Harry said. "Every several centuries," Hermione said, nodding at speed, the nodding of someone whose thoughts are running faster than the conversation. "It chooses, and the text is very specific about the word chooses. The Proto-Gaelic root distinguishes between passive selection and active choosing. This is active. It chose me," Harry said. "And you survived the killing curse," Hermione said. The text describes, in the previous 2 recorded Nexus events, the Nexus binding occurs at a moment of extraordinary survival, a moment when a frequency is maintained against something that should have ended it. Grid it binds at the point of continuation, where something continues that shouldn't have. She paused, her voice had gone quieter. "You continued." The 3 of them sat with that. Ron said after the right amount of time, "So you're not connected to the grid." "No," Harry said, "you're a piece of it." "A junction," Harry said, "where dimensions meet." Ron looked at the diagram again. He looked at Harry, he said with the completeness of someone who has arrived at a thing and found it to be exactly the thing he expected, except real. "Right," Hermione said, "Dumbledore knows." "Yes," Harry said. "Snape knows something adjacent to it," Hermione said. "The way he looked at you in potions, and in the bathroom corridor, when he was looking at where you'd been standing, he has information. Different information from Dumbledore's, the kind of information you get from a different angle. Death Eater research," Harry said. Hermione went still. Ron went still. "Before he was on our side," Harry said, not explaining where he'd arrived at our side from, because they both knew, because Hogwarts was a place where the staff's histories were available if you read the right books and asked the right questions and understood what you were reading. When he was with Voldemort, they would have researched the grid. If Voldemort wants power, really wants it, wants the foundational structure of everything, the grid would be in the research. Snape would have read it, and then changed sides, Hermione said, working through it at speed, and came to Hogwarts, and is now teaching potions next to a first year who is a Nexus, which she stopped. "That's why he looks at you like that. He read the material," Harry said. "He knows what the Nexus event looks like in theory. He's been recalibrating the theory against the reality." "Which is you," Ron said, sitting in the front row eating his potions. Second row, Hermione said. Second row, Ron agreed. Harry looked at the diagram for a moment longer, the 7 symbols, the central circle, the lines radiating outward. The grid ran it like a familiar sound, a chord and a key it had always known. He turned to the second page. Hermione had a translation tucked there too. On the second page, below the large individual renderings of the 7 symbols, 2 words in the original language, annotated by Hermione in both a linguistic analysis and a contextual interpretation. 2 words in her translation were, "Beware corruption." Harry read it. He read the annotation. He looked at the symbols again and felt the grid run through each of them and note, in its frequency language, what they referred to: 7 qualities, 7 capacities, 7 aspects of what the Nexus was for, and at the edge of each, the same thing, the same note, the same directional advisory. The note said, "This can be taken from you, but only if you let the frequency be reached by the wrong hands." He looked up at Hermione and Ron. Outside the library windows, the Saturday morning moved on. Someone walked past the shelves. The dust turned in the light between the rows. "We need to know what's behind that door on the 3rd floor," Harry said. "Yes," Hermione said. "We need to know it before whoever's inside Quirrell does whatever they came here to do." "Yes," she said again. "And we should probably tell someone," Ron said. Harry thought about McGonagall's face saying, "Come to me," and meaning it. He thought about Dumbledore's flat hands. He thought about the folder with Hagrid's silence and Ollivander's relief and Snape's 3-second look and the conversation he'd overheard, had not overheard, had simply received through the castle's stone via the grid's structural read, about Dumbledore's plan and what it required of a boy who had not been asked about it. "We'll tell McGonagall," he said, "about Quirrell, the frequency, what I read in the corridor." He paused. "That's hers to handle. The other thing, the door, what's behind it, why the secondary presence wants it, that one we keep working." Ron said, "Because Dumbledore already knows about the other thing." "Because Dumbledore already knows," Harry agreed, "and is managing it toward a specific outcome, and the specific outcome involves me, and I haven't been asked about it." "Yet," Hermione said. "Yet," Harry said. She closed the book with the care it deserved. Ron finished his biscuit. The morning light moved across the table in its usual way, unhurried, indifferent to urgency. The grid was warm in Harry's chest, steady, even the low gold frequency of its normal operation, running through the old stone of the library's foundations the way it ran through everything, foundational and patient and entirely sure. He picked up the book and opened it to the first page. There was more to read. Chapter 3, The Frequency He Was Born in. Harry woke at 3 in the morning on the last day of May and lay still. The grid was running at a register he hadn't felt before, not louder, not faster, but directed, the way a river directs when the channel narrows and the same volume of water finds a single vector. It was pointing downward and north-northwest, which was through the castle's foundation, through the dungeon levels, through the trapdoor that Fluffy guarded with his 3 arguments. The directional pull had been building for 2 weeks. Tonight it was not building, tonight it had arrived. He counted his breaths, 1 to 15 calibration. The grid signal held steady on 15. He sat up. The dormitory was 4 other boys breathing in their different rhythms. Seamus the shallowest, Dean the most even, Neville with a slight catch at the top of each breath that hadn't been there in September but was there now, the signature of someone carrying something that disrupted rest. Ron breathed like someone who had no unfinished business with the dark, long and complete, a person whose relationship with sleep was uncomplicated by anything that waited in it. Harry looked at Ron's closed curtains and made the calculation he'd been deferring for 2 weeks, ever since the library and Hermione's translated page and the word corruption underlined in her careful hand. He had deferred it because deferral was a tool, not a habit. You deferred when the correct moment was not yet, and you moved when it was. Tonight the grid's directional certainty had ended the deferral. He was moving. The calculation about Ron was not, should I wake him? The calculation was, what does it cost him if I don't? He had spent a year watching Ron absorb difficulty with the equanimity of someone who understood that the people you chose came with weight, and that the weight was part of the choice. Ron had chosen. The cost of not waking him was not Harry's to decide. He crossed to Ron's bed and knocked once on the bedpost. Not a dramatic knock, the knock of one person letting another know they were there. Ron was sitting up in 20 seconds. He looked at Harry with the clear-eyed immediacy of someone who had been sleeping lightly, which meant he had also been waiting. He said nothing. He started pulling on his robes. Harry nodded and went to the door. The girls' staircase was a specific architectural problem. It converted to a slide if a boy attempted it, a security measure Harry had found logistically inconvenient since October when he'd needed to reach Hermione about something that couldn't wait. He stood at the bottom and did what he'd done 3 times since then. He extended the grid's reach upward through the stone of the staircase, a narrow, focused warmth, the specific register of the frequency when it was directed at someone in his radius rather than reading ambient space, not a summons. More like the tap on a shoulder of someone who already knew you were there. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Hermione came down the stairs with her bag already on her shoulder and her hair in its sleeping state, and a look that said she had been awake since at least midnight. Under her arm, the old book, the one with the 7 symbols and her annotated translation, and a second notebook that Harry hadn't seen before, which was thick and had tabs. She looked at Harry, she looked at Ron. She said, "Quirrell went through the trapdoor 40 minutes ago." Ron said, "How do you—" "I felt the wrong frequency signal drop," Harry said, because that was the accurate explanation, and they had all learned, over the preceding months, to use accurate explanations among themselves rather than comfortable ones. "It's been in the castle's baseline read since September. Tonight it's gone. He's below the castle." "He's gone for the stone," Hermione said. "Whatever's behind Fluffy, whatever the corridor was protecting, I spent the last 2 weeks identifying it, and the evidence is consistent enough that I'm confident it's the Philosopher's Stone, specifically Flamels. Dumbledore moved it here in the summer." She said this with the delivery of a person reporting a concluded analysis, "and the secondary presence using Quirrell has been positioning for tonight since Halloween. The troll was a test of the castle's response time. Tonight is the actual approach. And Dumbledore is away," Ron said. Harry said, "He arranged to be." Both of them looked at him. "He was called away urgently this evening," Harry said. "Ministry communication, very insistent, very specific timing. He left at 9. He paused. "The grid's been reading Dumbledore's attention since September. It's directional the same way it reads any attention that's focused on the Nexus. Tonight, Dumbledore's attention pointed away, and then an hour later the wrong frequency signal dropped from the castle's baseline. He looked at them steadily. He arranged to be away. He left the path open. He wants to see what I do." Hermione went through several expressions quickly. "That's," she said, and stopped, and started again on a different register. "That is exactly the kind of pragmatic, terrifying, technically defensible thing that—" She stopped again. "We'll discuss what I think about that later. Right now we need to go." "Now I need to go," Harry said. "You both need to get to McGonagall." Hermione said, "Absolutely not." Ron said, "Yeah, no." Harry looked at them. Ron had his arms folded with the comfortable certainty of someone who had made a decision prior to the conversation and was not going to be argued out of it. Hermione had her bag properly settled on both shoulders and her chin at the angle it occupied when she was prepared to maintain a position through all available resistance. Harry recognized both postures and understood that this was not negotiable in the direction he'd been negotiating. He recalibrated. "Right," he said. "We go together." McGonagall gets the note. Hermione pulled a folded square of parchment from her bag. "Already written it," she said. "I pushed it under her door on the way down." Ron looked at the parchment and looked at Hermione. "When did you—" "Midnight," she said. "When I was sure, I wrote 2 versions. One for if we went together, one for if Harry went alone. I've sent the first one." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't plan for both outcomes." Harry thought that this was one of the best things about Hermione Granger. She did not dress up preparation as spontaneity, and she did not apologize for the preparation. She had written 2 letters at midnight because both possibilities were real and both deserved a plan. He thought this was exactly right. "Come on," he said. The 3rd-floor corridor was empty and dark, the torch brackets cold, no reason for warmth in a corridor that wasn't supposed to have anyone in it. The door at the end was locked by the same charm it had been locked by since September, which was a spell a first year could open, which Harry had thought since September was a message about the door's real purpose. He put his wand to it, the lock turned. They pushed the door and stood in the entrance. Fluffy's breathing was the first thing, 3 separate tempos of it, asynchronous, the overlapping rhythms of 3 sleeping heads. The harp beside the door had been played recently. Its strings held a resonance that the grid could read like a heat signature, the ghost of the last note still in the metal. 22 minutes ago, based on the decay rate. "Someone played it already," Ron said low. "Quirrell," Harry confirmed. "The secondary presence has been researching Fluffy's requirements since November. The harp solution has been in his notes since Christmas." He paused. "I know that because the grid's been reading the wrong frequency signals focus every time I walk past this door, and how to get through this door has been what it's focused on since January." Hermione looked at him. "You've been reading its research focus." "It was reading mine," Harry said. "I read back." She wrote something in the margin of her notebook, moving quickly. The trapdoor was in the center of the floor, to the right of the leftmost sleeping head. Harry moved to it with his attention on the harp. The strings were still, the resonance fading toward inaudible. He looked at Hermione. She knew. She was already beginning to hum, barely a sound, barely anything, but exactly the pitch the harp's strings remembered, matching the frequency of the last played note, giving the air what it had been given 22 minutes ago. She did it with the concentrated precision of a person who had been practicing this specific pitch for 3 weeks, ever since they'd identified the harp's function, ever since she'd cataloged what would be necessary. The 3 heads settled, the trapdoor opened. Harry looked down, dark below, the specific dark of underground spaces and the smell of earth and something green and growing. He looked at Ron and Hermione. Hermione's chin was at its decided angle. Ron had his wand out and was looking at the drop with the forward assessment of someone calculating distance. Harry went first. The drop was longer than it appeared and ended in something that ended it softly, plant material, dense and giving, the devil's snare wrapping around his ankles and wrists with the reflexive hunger of a plant whose entire evolutionary history was one long argument against light and warmth. Harry felt it tighten. He breathed in once and let the grid run its warmth outward from his skin, not a blast, not a flare, just the sustained ambient warmth of a body that ran several degrees above normal, the warmth of a clear afternoon in July, the frequency of sunlight rendered into presence. The devil's snare pulled away from him in stages, retracting from his wrists first, then his ankles, pressing itself back against the walls of the chamber with the confused behavior of a plant whose threat response had been met with something it had no category for. By the time Ron dropped and then Hermione dropped, the plant had arranged itself against the perimeter with what Harry could only describe as an apologetic quality. Ron looked at the retreated plant. He looked at Harry. "Did you just," he said, "make it feel bad for grabbing you?" "Made it feel like summer," Harry said. "Same outcome." Hermione looked at the devil's snare with the expression of a person filing a methodological observation. "I had bluebell flames ready," she said, to no one in particular. "I know," Harry said. "Keep them ready." They moved forward. The key room was noise and motion, and the specific chaos of 1,000 things that didn't want to be caught. The winged keys moved through the chamber in overlapping patterns, metallic and various, 1,000 glints in torchlight. The locked door at the end had a keyhole that was architecturally obvious. 3 brooms stood against the wall. Ron was already assessing the pattern, tilting his head in the way he tilted it over a chess board, the specific angle of spatial reasoning, the body making room for the mind to work in 3 dimensions. Harry was reading the key frequencies through the grid's spatial map, the same spatial awareness that had returned the Remembrall from 30 feet and read Quirrell's corridor trajectory before completion. Every key had a frequency the grid could distinguish, a faint magical signature specific to each, the enchantment giving each one a slightly different resonance. Harry ran through them, sorting by frequency, looking for the anomaly. The correct key would have been used most recently. Its enchantment would have a different signature from the unused ones, not depleted exactly, but accessed, the way an object carries the trace of the last hands that handled it. He found it in 4 seconds, third from the left on the upstream arc. Silver, slightly larger than average, a bent right wing that made its flight pattern asymmetric, listing in a slow rightward drift. Quirrell would have had to chase it. Harry waited. Ron was on a broom. Harry was on a broom. They went up. Harry let Ron make the first pass, not because he needed Ron to do it. The grid's spatial map had the key's trajectory extrapolated to a precision that made the intercept trivial, but because watching Ron fly was genuinely worth watching, the way watching someone do the thing they're made for is worth watching regardless of its utility. Ron flew well. He flew with his whole body rather than just his hands, using the broom's responses as feedback, adjusting with his weight. He had grown up watching his brothers do this and had absorbed it the way he absorbed everything worth absorbing, quietly over time until it was structural. He missed the key by 8 inches on the first pass. He adjusted good adjustment, correct reading of the miss, and narrowed the gap on the second to 2 inches. Harry waited for the third pass, noted the trajectory, went up on the exact intercept line, and had the key in his hand before his broom's forward motion had fully committed. One smooth line, up, intercept, descend. He handed it to Hermione on the ground. She had the door open in 4 seconds. They went through. The chess room had the quality of all rooms that have been built to contain a single specific thing and have been waiting for that thing a long time. The scale was absolute, the board stretching wall to wall, the pieces 2 feet taller than a grown man, the stone of them worn smooth by the enchantment, the white pieces on the far side with the stillness of something that has done this many times and is not hurrying. Harry stood at the edge of the board, and the grid ran a spatial map of all 64 squares and all remaining pieces, and every piece's range, and the intersection of possible moves forward from the current state. The analysis was not calculation exactly. It was the grid's 3-dimensional read of the position, the same awareness that found keys in motion and read troll navigation, and identified frequency signals in a corridor, applied to a tactical system. He had the whole game visible, from current state to terminal state, the paths between them arrayed like a map with the efficient routes marked. He looked at Ron. Ron was already in it. He had walked to the center of the board's edge, and was standing with his head tilted, and his eyes moving across the arrangement with the quality of complete absorption, the rest of the room temporarily suspended in favor of this. He said without looking up, "I've got this." "I know," Harry said. Hermione said, "Ron, I've got it," he said again, and he said it with the specific tone of someone who has found the thing they are exactly the right shape for and knows it and is not going to pretend otherwise. "Give me a minute." He took 2, then he moved a piece and the game began. Harry stood at the side of the board and watched. He did not offer moves. He had the full game mapped and he kept it to himself, because it was Ron's game and the grid's gift was not meant to override the person beside him. It was meant, as Ollivander had said on a September afternoon in a narrow shop, to translate, not generate, translate. Harry translated when translation was needed and kept the river back when it wasn't. Ron played with complete concentration and a quiet that was different from his normal quiet. His normal quiet was the quiet of someone conserving energy for something physical. This quiet was the quiet of someone who has gone entirely inside the problem and left his body to manage the board surface while his mind managed the geometry. He moved pieces without hesitation. He made sacrifices, a bishop here, a rook there, each with the clean acceptance of someone who understands that every valuable position has a cost and has already done the accounting. Harry watched the pattern emerge, watched the endgame approach, watched Ron build toward the terminal position, and watched the specific square that the terminal position required, and watched Ron's eyes find that square and stay on it. Ron turned and looked at Harry. Just that, a look. The specific quality of a look between two people when one of them is about to do something that can't be undone, and both of them know it and neither of them is going to dishonor it by talking about it. Harry held the look for the full length of it. Ron turned back to the board. He moved his knight to the required square with the direct, unadorned motion of someone executing a decision that has been made. White queen moved. The knight went down. Harry was standing in the same spot when it happened. He did not move. But the grid ran. It ran hard and gold and hot through his chest and spine, and the bones of his hands and the stone floor registered it in a ring, the bases of the nearest chess pieces melting fractionally at their foundations, the stone going soft for half a second and resolidifying. The ring in the stone was faint and exact. It was the shape of what it cost. Hermione's hand found Harry's forearm, not gripping. Present, he looked at her. Her face was doing the thing it did when she had decided on a response and was implementing it with full commitment, complete, controlled, the emotion not absent but directed, functioning as fuel rather than noise. Her eyes were bright in the torchlight and she was not going to stop. Is he? Ron said from the board. Breathing, Harry said, because the grid had read Ron's frequency. The moment the piece fell and the frequency was present and strong and the spatial signal of his breathing was even. He's breathing. He's intact. Concussion, probably, Hermione said, and her voice was steady in the way of a person doing an extremely good job of staying in motion. He needs to go back. He needs to go back to the entrance and get help. She looked at Harry and her voice dropped a register. Go, we're going. Harry looked at Ron. Ron was on his back on the board looking at the ceiling of the chamber with an expression of someone taking inventory. Harry crossed to him, stepping over the cleared pieces, and crouched. Ron looked at him. The board's clear, Ron said. I saw, Harry said. So? Ron's eyes were steady. Go on then. McGonagall's note was from Hermione, Harry said. She'll be here soon. You stay with her. Ron looked at him for a moment with the expression of a person who wants to argue and knows the argument is not available. Right, he said. Don't do anything stupid. Relative to what? Harry said. Ron almost laughed. Harry stood and turned, and Hermione was already at the door on the far side, which had swung open with the chess game's conclusion. She had the potions notes out, the page she'd worked on for 3 weeks, the 7-bottle puzzle solution mapped from the secondary sources she'd identified, the temperature and density analysis of what black flame and purple flame meant in terms of magical properties. They went through. Potions room was exactly as the secondary sources had described. Purple flame behind, black flame ahead, 7 bottles on a table, a card. Hermione read the card and her eyes moved across the bottles with the specific speed of someone running a simultaneous analysis on multiple variables, comparing size against elimination logic against the positioning convention in this class of riddle, against the thermal magical properties of the flame colors, against the secondary source material. Her pen was not moving, her eyes were moving and her mouth was still, and she was done in less than 90 seconds. She picked up the smallest bottle and handed it to Harry. She picked up a round bottle from the right end and held it herself. Yours goes forward, she said. Mine goes back. She looked at him with the directness she used when a thing needed saying without embellishment. I'm going back to Ron, you're going forward. She paused. Not because I couldn't come with you, and not because you don't need anyone. Because Ron is back there and someone who can think needs to be with someone who's injured. And she stopped and started again, different register. Because you're the Nexus, Harry. The thing through that flame knows it. And what happens in that room is between the grid and whatever's been corrupting it, and I don't think me being in the room helps that. Harry looked at the black flame. The grid's directional pull through it was absolute, no ambiguity, no equivocation, the river's commitment to its channel. When I'm back, he said, we should probably talk about the Horcruxes. Hermione's expression held for 2 full seconds. You know, she said. You know, he said back. Since December, she said. Since December, he agreed. They looked at each other across the table with the 7 bottles. Purple flame at their backs cast their shadows forward into the black flame ahead. Hermione's shadow was very straight. The grid ran warm through Harry's sternum, and he breathed it even and looked at her face and understood. in the precise and unspoken way that certain things are understood between people who have chosen each other, that she had been carrying this alone since December because she hadn't been sure how to give it to him without breaking something. He understood why. He didn't hold it. Don't let him be alone when he wakes up, Harry said. Never, she said. He drank the bottle. He stepped through the black flame. The mirror room was large and vaulted and cold in the specific way of places where something has been wanted for a long time. Not the cold of temperature, but the cold of intention, the atmosphere left behind by sustained yearning directed at a specific point in space. The mirror of Eris stood on its brass feet at the chamber's center, the inscription carved in its frame, Eris stra eru oit ube kafru oit on wosi. Quirrell stood before it. His hands were moving at his sides in the repetitive motion of someone who has arrived at an obstacle and has been attempting and failing to pass it for some time. He was muttering. The wrong frequency signal was louder than Harry had ever heard it in the castle, not louder as in volume, but louder as in presence. The secondary signal, no longer riding the primary, but driving it. Quirrell's own frequency, suppressed to the floor by the weight of what was using him. Turban was wrong, Harry noted. It had been wrong all year, but now he understood its specific wrongness. It was a containment measure. Whatever was behind it had chosen the back of a human head as its accommodation, the closest available position to a human brain, to the nerve structures that allowed voluntary movement, to the sensory input that allowed navigation. The turban was covering something that should not be covered, and the something knew Harry was there. Quirrell turned. The stutter was entirely gone. The nervous lean was gone. The apologetic quality of his expression was gone. What looked at Harry from Quirrell's face was not Quirrell. It used Quirrell's eyes and Quirrell's mouth and Quirrell's hands, but it occupied the space behind them with a different architecture, a different frequency signature, the specific quality of something ancient and very controlled, and accustomed to having its way in every room it had ever entered. Harry Potter, it said, with Quirrell's voice and nothing of Quirrell's inflection. I had wondered if you'd come, or if Dumbledore had, in fact, made it too easy to come, which would make your arrival less impressive. A pause. The wrong frequency signal was reading Harry, actively and openly now, no longer the subtle probe it had been all year, but a direct scan, the frequency reaching toward the grid's nexus with the specific application of something that has been studying a target and has finally decided to engage it directly. I can feel it, it said, even at this distance. The nexus, how long have you carried that? Since the night you killed my parents, Harry said. The grid ran steady in his chest, warm, even. I didn't kill you, the voice said, and it said it with the specific interest of someone who has been thinking about this for a decade. I have thought about that occasionally in the years since. What it means that you continued. It means the grid chose, Harry said, and the grid doesn't unchoose. Quirrell's mouth moved in something that wasn't a smile, the expression of a face being used by someone who knows how expressions work and deploys them as communication rather than feeling them. The Morphin Grid, it said, is not a patron, it is not a guardian, it is a power source, the largest available, and power sources exist to be used, by those with the capacity and the will. The wrong frequency signal extended further, reading deeper into the grid's structure, looking for an access point, looking for the frequency interface that would allow what Quirrell was hosting to reach the nexus directly. Stand aside from the mirror, Harry Potter. I don't need the nexus to take what's in that mirror. I simply find it more elegant to do it without fighting you. You can't take the stone from the mirror, Harry said. I am working on that, the voice said, and it was an honest statement. Without the frustration a lesser intelligence would have let into it. The mirror's enchantment is specific. It shows the desire, but only delivers the stone to someone who wants it without intending to use it. Paradox designed for my specific inconvenience. A pause. But enchantments have edges. Every enchantment has an edge where the logic becomes technical rather than intentional, and at technical edges, skill is sufficient. The stone won't help you, Harry said. Even with the Philosopher's Stone, even with immortality, you'd still be what you are, a corrupted frequency riding a body that can't hold you, trying to hijack a power structure you fundamentally misunderstand. The wrong frequency signal pushed. It was not a gentle probe now. It came toward the grid's nexus with the specific intention of a frequency that had been reading a system and had decided it understood the system's architecture well enough to attempt access. It was skilled. Voldemort had spent a decade studying the grid from whatever form he occupied between bodies, had done the research the Death Eaters had done before him, had learned the frequency structure the way you learn a language from a distance, theoretically, comprehensively, and with the specific blind spots of someone who has never actually lived inside it. Grid's response was not Harry's decision. The Nexus received the incoming frequency the way a correctly tuned system receives interference. It processed it, identified it, and filtered it. Not with force. Force was not the grid's primary mode. Force was the blunt application of one signal overwhelming another, and the grid's foundational logic was not dominance but coherence, the maintenance of the dimensional architecture's integrity against frequencies that destabilized it. Voldemort's signal was, in technical terms, a stabilization threat. The grid filtered stabilization threats the way a body filters pathogens, specifically completely, with the practiced efficiency of a system that has been doing this since before human memory. The push hit the grid's filter and came back corrupted. Quirrell's hands went to his head. The voice said, "Interesting." It was not deterred. It said it with the analytical register of a researcher encountering unexpected data. "You're not blocking. The structure itself is." It pushed again, differently from a different angle, trying the frequency interface from an adjacent approach. The grid filtered again. Same result. "You can't access it from outside," Harry said. "It's not an object, it's not a system with an interface. It's a frequency that I am. You can't reach into a person's fundamental frequency and take it any more than you can reach into a river and take the water's wetness." Quirrell's eyes changed. Voice said, "Then I will reach into you and take the person." And it tried, which was a different thing entirely. Not the frequency probe, but a direct psychic approach. The same class of magic as legilimency, but amplified by the decade of disembodied existence that had stripped Voldemort of almost everything except the purest and most concentrated versions of his will. Came in through the channel a parcel-tongue resonance would use, the deep frequency vibration that snake language ran on, the specific wavelength of Voldemort's natural register, trying to find a matching note in Harry's psyche. Harry let it in. This was not the plan he had. He didn't have a plan in the ordinary sense. He had the grid's logic, and the grid's logic said, "A frequency you refuse to receive becomes noise. Frequency you receive and assess and filter becomes data." He let the intrusion arrive the way you let a visitor arrive, through the door rather than the wall, and the grid ran it through the Nexus filter, with the same complete efficiency it had run the signal probe, and what came out the other side was information. Voldemort's will was extraordinary. Harry would remember this, file it accurately. The will was extraordinary, genuine in its conviction, built on a decade of refinement into its purest possible expression. The fear of death was not even fear anymore. It was architecture, the foundational premise of a complete philosophical system. Everything else had been stripped away in the decade of near non-existence, until what remained was the single, absolute, unequivocal refusal to end. Harry understood it. He didn't agree with it, but he understood it. He filtered it. Intrusion came back changed. Not destroyed. Voldemort was not destroyable by this. But the specific application of his will against Harry's psyche had encountered a structure that absorbed it rather than breaking under it, and the force that had been directed at Harry's identity returned to Voldemort's consciousness with its own nature reflected in it, which was not what he had intended and was, Harry thought, the most informative thing that had happened in the room so far. "You've never filtered one before," the voice said, and it was quieter now. "You've been filtering since you were a child." "Yes," Harry said. He turned to the mirror. The mirror showed him the room he had described in the library, to no one in his own thoughts, on a night in November when he had been lying in the dormitory, unable to sleep and thinking about what he wanted. He had not said it aloud. He had thought it, the way you think things you are not ready to say, and the mirror went into the thought and found it and showed it back. The Gryffindor common room, or a room like it, with a fire going and a chessboard on the floor and books on every surface. Ron cross-legged with a piece in each hand, in argument with himself. Hermione annotating, one knee up, pen going fast. Harry in between them, not doing anything in particular except being there in the room, present, the grid warm and distributed, and not a weight he was carrying alone. The stone was already in his pocket. He registered this in the same moment he recognized the image. The stone's weight, solid and warm, the specific density of something that had been inside the mirror's enchantment, and had resolved into his hand through the grid's receiving pull, the open palm gesture of something returning to where it belonged. He had not reached for it consciously. The mirror had shown him what he wanted, not the stone, not power, not victory, and in showing it had found nothing in him that wanted to use the stone for its own purposes, and the enchantment had resolved correctly. He turned back to Quirrell. "It's gone," the voice said. It understood. It had felt the stone leave the mirror's field. "Give it to me." "No," Harry said. Voice said, "Give it to me." And this time it was not a sentence but a frequency assault. The full amplitude of Voldemort's will expressed as a direct attack on the grid's nexus. All the remaining power available to a disembodied consciousness that had been existing on the structural edge of existence for a decade, everything compressed into one directed application. It was genuinely formidable. Harry recognized that. He stood in it the way you stand in a very strong current, feet set, weight forward, not fighting the current's direction but finding the position within it that the current couldn't move. Quirrell moved. He crossed the room toward Harry with the committed motion of someone who has placed everything on one action, and Harry did not step back. The grid's spatial read gave him Quirrell's trajectory in full, the approach angle, the specific reach of Quirrell's arms at full extension. He waited. Quirrell's hands reached his collar and made contact. The grid responded. It didn't respond to Quirrell. Quirrell was a person who had made terrible choices and was currently being used, which was the specific horror of his situation, and the grid did not resolve horror by adding to it. The grid responded to the frequency that was driving Quirrell, the corrupted signal that had been probing and testing and attempting access since September. It responded to it the way the filter had responded to the probe, the way the Nexus had received and assessed and rejected the direct psychic assault. Complete, efficient. The corrupted frequency hit the grid's contact filter through Quirrell's hands, and the filter resolved it with the same logic it applied to everything the grid encountered. Does this resonate or not? The frequency of Voldemort's will, pressed at full amplitude through Quirrell's hands against Harry's collar, did not resonate. The universe rejected it the way the universe rejects division by zero, not with a decision, not with force, not with anything so purposeful as a counterstrike, but with the flat, absolute, uninterested clarity of a law being a law. The contact lasted half a second. Quirrell's hands opened. He took 2 steps backward. His expression passed through several states that were all his own, the first expressions entirely his own that Harry had seen from him all year, the face underneath the face, and they were not the face of a cruel man. They were the face of a man who had been used up and knew it, and was, in the last coherent moment available to him, aware of exactly what he'd lost. He went down, not dramatically, not slowly. He folded inward the way a structure folds when its load-bearing element is gone, and he was on the stone floor and he was not going to get up, and the turban unraveled, and from the back of Quirrell's exposed head, something moved. It was the absence of something rather than the presence of something, a frequency that withdrew, a signal that stepped back from its material anchor and became ambient again, diffuse, moving for the ceiling and through it because walls were not a barrier to a disembodied will that had navigated without a body for a decade. The wraith passed through the stone above and was gone. The room was very cold and absolutely still. Harry stood in the center of it, in the cold, with the stone in his pocket and Quirrell on the floor and the mirror beside him showing his own reflection, just his reflection, exactly as he was, nothing more, and he sat down on the stone floor. Not because he was hurt, not because the grid was depleted or destabilized or anything less than its exact normal operational warmth in his chest. He sat down because sitting was the correct response to having just experienced the full amplitude of Voldemort's will attempting to dismantle him, and because the stone was in his pocket, and because his friends were somewhere above him injured and worried and waiting, and because there was a very specific kind of quiet that happens after something large and dangerous is over, and the body needs 30 seconds to catch up with the fact. He sat, he counted. He let the grid run its baseline read on the room, Quirrell's failing frequency, the mirror's enchantment settling back into dormancy, the castle's foundation layers running their own deep frequencies as they always did, old and patient and indifferent to the specific crises of the centuries they'd witnessed. He had known Dumbledore was coming. The grid had read Dumbledore's attention, swinging back toward the castle the moment the wrong frequency signal had left the baseline. The same gravitational read that had tracked the directed absence now tracked the return. Harry had 6 minutes, roughly. He used the first 2 sitting. Then he stood and put the stone in his left pocket and his hands in both pockets and waited. Dumbledore came through the black flame at 6 minutes and 14 seconds, which was close enough. He came in with the measured pace of a man who has been moving quickly and has slowed before the door. The same deceleration Harry had recognized in McGonagall when she came to talk to him about something that required a specific register. He looked at Quirrell, he looked at the mirror, which was showing nothing. He looked at Harry. He said, "Are you hurt?" "No," Harry said. "The stone." Harry took it from his left pocket and held it out. Dumbledore crossed the room. He took it with the specific care of someone, taking a very old and consequential object from a person who had kept it intact against considerable opposition. He looked at it for a moment. He put it in his robes. He looked at Harry. His expression was composed. His hands were at his sides. He was doing an excellent job of all of it. "My friends," Harry said. "Ron was knocked off the chessboard. They're already in the hospital wing," Dumbledore said. "Miss Granger arrived at Professor McGonagall's door 9 minutes after you entered the trapdoor." She had an annotated summary of the secondary presence's identity, the stone's location, the trapdoor's defensive layers, and a medical assessment of what Mr. Weasley would likely need. A pause. Madame Pomfrey was very efficient. "Good," Harry said. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, specific. The specific silence of 2 people who are both aware of the actual shape of the conversation and are taking a moment before they walk into it. Harry walked into it. "You arranged to be called away," he said. Dumbledore did not move. His expression did not change at the surface. At the edges, something shifted, an almost imperceptible adjustment, the kind of change that registers in the grid's read of a person's ambient signal rather than in their visible expression. "Yes," he said. Not "what makes you say that," not "I don't know what you mean," not the deflection available to him which Harry had been watching for and which had not appeared. "You've been watching what I do since September," Harry said. "The flying lesson, the troll, the Quidditch match, all of it. You're not observing, you're testing." "Yes," Dumbledore said again, "and tonight was the final exam." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He moved slowly to the mirror and looked at his own reflection, which the mirror was showing him without ornament. His hands were at his sides. Harry watched the hands with the same attention he'd watched them in the Great Hall on the first night. They were still with effort. Not the final exam, Dumbledore said. There is no final exam for what's coming. Tonight was, he paused and selected the word with the care of someone who has decided honesty is the correct register and is applying it as precisely as they can. Tonight was my own answer to a question I've been asking myself since before you arrived at Hogwarts. Whether you would act correctly without instruction, without management. Whether the grid's choice was, in practical terms, as sound as it was cosmologically inevitable. Harry looked at him. And, you recovered the stone by being the one person in this room who didn't want it for its own sake, Dumbledore said. You filtered Voldemort's will rather than fighting it, which meant you were never in a position to be broken by it. You sat down on the floor afterward. He paused. The last is not strategic. But it tells me something important. That I know when something is over, Harry said. That you are grounded, Dumbledore said, and he said it with the weight of someone for whom that word had specific, earned meaning. The grid didn't choose a weapon. It didn't choose a vessel. It chose a person who had already learned to carry it and remain a person. He looked away from the mirror. I had hoped for this. I had not been certain. You decided not to tell me things, Harry said. About what I am, about why, about the plan you have for Voldemort. Dumbledore looked at him directly. Yes, I know about the Horcruxes, Harry said. The silence that followed was the longest silence in the room. It lasted longer than the chess game, and longer than Quirrell's approach, and longer than the contact and its aftermath. Dumbledore stood in it with an expression that had opened in a way his expressions rarely opened. Not broken, not defeated, but transparent in the specific way of a face receiving information that genuinely surprises it, and finding, in the surprise, that its own prior certainty had been wrong in a way that mattered. Since December, Harry said. Hermione found the cross-references. We've known since December. Dumbledore said, I see. We've been working on it since December, Harry said. Independently, without the information you have, which means we've done it less efficiently than we could have. We know there are 6 remaining. We think one of them might be. He stopped. There were things he wasn't sure of yet, and he was not going to say things he wasn't sure of, not even to Dumbledore, not especially to Dumbledore. We've been working on it. Dumbledore sat down. He did it in the same way Harry had sat down, not with drama, not with collapse, just with the decision of a man who needed a different altitude for the next part of the conversation. He sat with his back against the mirror's base, his robes around him, his hands finally in his lap with the quality of not placement, just rest. He looked old, not ancient the way he usually looked old, which was the majestic kind, just old. Like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just been told the person beside him had been helping with it for months without being asked. I made a decision, he said, that the weight of what is coming was mine to manage, to organize, to direct from a position of complete information toward the most survivable outcome for the most people. He paused. I have made this kind of decision before, with Grindelwald, with the war. I have been right often enough that I have perhaps become more certain of being right than the evidence warrants. You're very good at it, Harry said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an acknowledgement of a fact that had costs. I am, Dumbledore said, which has made it difficult over decades to identify the specific cases where being very good at something is not sufficient justification for doing it. He looked at his hands. Deciding alone what an 11-year-old boy should know about his own life and his own death, he stopped. No level of competence makes that decision mine to make. Harry waited. The room was cold. Quirrell's form on the floor was the form of someone who had been used entirely and had nothing left, and looking at it was instructive. Harry looked at it and thought about what it meant to be used so completely that the thing that made you a person was gone, and he thought about plans, and he thought about what Hermione had said at midnight writing 2 letters, which was that you planned for all outcomes because they were all real. Here is what I need, Harry said. Not a request, what I need. Dumbledore looked up. I need to be told things that concern me, Harry said, before they concern me where possible. When that's not possible, when the situation is what the situation is and preparation isn't available, I need to be told immediately after. I need Hermione and Ron to be included in what I'm included in, because they are already included, and excluding them is both pointless and insulting. I need you to give me the information about the Horcruxes, all of it, everything you know, so we can work on it from a complete picture. He paused. And I need to be asked, not managed. Asked. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. The cold of the room was steady. The mirror stood above them both, and if it showed anything to either of them, it was private. There is a thing, Dumbledore said carefully, that I have not told anyone, about the Horcruxes, about the specific nature of the last one. He paused. I have not told anyone because it is the kind of information that, delivered at the wrong moment, makes living through the intervening time nearly impossible. Tell me, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. The expression was reading Harry the way Harry read frequencies, with full attention, looking for the signal beneath the surface. You already know, Dumbledore said, not accusing, confirming. I have a theory, Harry said. I haven't said it out loud. Dumbledore was very still, because saying it out loud makes it real. Because saying it out loud before I've verified it gives it a weight I'd have to carry without the information to work with it, Harry said. Which is exactly what you've been doing to me all year, except from the other direction. Dumbledore closed his eyes. Briefly, he opened them. Yes, he said, I see the parallel. It was not intentional, it was fear, dressed up as caution. I know, Harry said. I could read it in your hands. Dumbledore looked at his hands in his lap. He turned them over, looked at the palms. Something in his expression moved, not amusement, not quite, but something in the same register as recognizing a thing that is true and finding it, on balance, fair. A decade, he said, of managing rooms and conversations and outcomes and situations, and it was my hands. Your hands have been talking all year, Harry said. What did they tell you? Harry thought about the first night in the Great Hall and the deliberate placement and the brass orrery on the desk corner, and about McGonagall's office visits, and about the quality of the stillness in Dumbledore's posture when he was performing confidence versus when he was genuinely feeling it. And he said that you were afraid of something you couldn't control. That the plan mattered more than you wanted it to, more than was healthy. That you have people you care about in this building, and you've been trying to protect them from a direction that would require them not to know about it. He paused. And that you didn't reach for the orrery tonight. When McGonagall told you things that unsettled you, I know about those conversations. The castle's stone carries the frequency of conversations, and I've been reading it all year. You reached for it. When you were genuinely afraid, you didn't. You made yourself not reach for it. Dumbledore was very still, because reaching for it would have confirmed that you were afraid, Harry said. And confirming that would have meant admitting that the plan wasn't as solid as you needed it to be. And if the plan wasn't solid, you'd have to revise it, and revision would have meant telling me things. He paused. So your hands gave it away by being too still. Dumbledore said very quietly, I have lived 110 years, Harry, and I have been read accurately by a very small number of people. He paused. It is a very strange experience to be read accurately by someone 11 years old. You arranged the last 11 years, Harry said. You've been shaping my situation since Godric's Hollow, the Dursleys, the cupboard. All of it, he said this without heat. It was a statement of fact, and he had made his peace with the fact, provisionally, enough to say it plainly. I don't think you meant it to go the way it went. I think you arranged the broad structure, the blood protection, the muggle upbringing, the distance from the magical world, and didn't look closely enough at the specific outcome. No, Dumbledore said. I didn't look closely enough. He said it with the quality of a confession rather than a defense. I told myself that difficult circumstances build necessary character. I have believed this, generally, as a principle. I used the principle to not look at the specific 11 years of a specific child. He paused. That is not something I can correct. I can only account for it going forward. Harry looked at him. Dumbledore met the look. I'm not a chess piece, Harry said. No, Dumbledore said. And you're not a villain, Harry said. You're a man who is very good at what he does and who has convinced himself over a long career of being right that being right is the same as having the authority to decide. It isn't. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. The cold room was quiet. Quirrell's form was still. The mirror stood. No, Dumbledore said. It isn't. I'll work with you, Harry said, on the Horcruxes, on what's coming. But I work with you, not for you, not in a plan I haven't been shown, not toward an outcome I haven't agreed to. He paused. When you have information that concerns me, you give it to me. When you're considering a decision that involves me, you ask me, not as a courtesy, as a requirement. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time with the expression of a man who is doing the honest accounting of what he is being asked and what it will cost him and whether the cost is appropriate. Harry could read the accounting in the quality of the silence, in the exact position of Dumbledore's hands in his lap, not deliberate, not placed, just resting, genuinely resting for the first time in the conversation. Yes, Dumbledore said. That was fast, Harry said. I have been afraid, Dumbledore said, of many things in my long life. What I am afraid of in this room right now is simpler than most of them. I'm afraid that I have been exactly the kind of authority that makes necessary things impossible, and that the person who has just told me so has considerably more reason to say it than most. A pause. Yes is the correct answer. Yes is the only answer that is worth anything. He paused again. I will not always get it right. I will sometimes revert to the management instinct because it is structural. It is very old in me, and recognizing the reversion requires catching it in real time. But I am telling you, yes, as a requirement, not as a courtesy. Harry received this. He held it the way the grid held things, not as triumph, not as resolution, but as material to work with. A frequency that had been dissonant for a year had moved slightly toward something that resonated, not consonant yet, but closer. Then we have a starting point, Harry said. He stood. He held out his hand. Dumbledore looked at the hand for a moment, the gesture of it, the specific register of a handshake offered not as deference, but as a horizontal acknowledgement between two parties who have just established terms. He stood, which was not a young man's motion and was nonetheless accomplished with dignity, and he took Harry's hand. They shook. Hospital wing, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. They went. The hospital wing was warm in the way that institutional warmth is warm, managed, reliable, the warmth of a place whose purpose is recovery, and which has taken that purpose seriously for a very long time. It smelled of Dittany and Madame Pomfrey's specific medicinal certainty, and faintly, of the pumpkin pasties that Mrs. Weasley had apparently sent by owl between Ron's injury and Harry's arrival, which was a speed of response that said everything about Mrs. Weasley and the system she'd built for exactly this kind of communication. Ron was in the second bed from the window, sitting up at an angle that suggested Madame Pomfrey had been firm about the angle's necessity. His left arm was in a sling. The pasties were open on his nightstand beside a glass of water and a potion bottle that had been mostly finished. His color was better than it had been on the chessboard. His expression, when Harry came through the door, was the expression of a boy who has been in this room for 40 minutes with nothing to do but think, and has done a significant amount of thinking, and is prepared to pretend otherwise. Hermione was in the chair beside the bed, with a book open across her knees that she was not reading. She looked at Harry from the feet up with the systematic assessment of someone who has been rehearsing the assessment for 40 minutes and is executing it now with maximum efficiency. She found no injuries. Something in her face changed quality. Harry crossed the room and sat on the end of Ron's bed. Ron said, "You took your time." "Had a conversation," Harry said, "with Dumbledore." "Yes." Ron absorbed this. "How'd it go?" "Better than expected," Harry said. "He's agreed to tell us things." Hermione looked up from the non-reading. Specifically the things we need to know," Harry said. "The Horcruxes, the full picture." "He knows we know. We're going to work with what he has." Hermione nodded once, with the quality of a nod that was also a note being filed under confirmed. "Continue." She reached into her bag and produced the thick notebook with the tabs, the one Harry hadn't seen before, and set it on the end of the bed between them. It had 7 tabs, each labeled in her precise hand, each covering one of the Horcruxes as she'd been able to identify them from the secondary sources. Ron looked at the notebook and looked at Harry. He reached into the pasty box and distributed one to each of them. Harry took the pasty. It was still warm, which was a small miracle and felt like exactly what it was, evidence that someone had thought about them in advance, from a distance, with the specific warmth of someone who considers having a thing ready for when they return to be a form of love. He ate. The hospital wing was quiet around them. Through the high windows, the grounds held the last of the May evening light, the long gold of northern summer evenings that didn't know when to stop. The lake was dark at its center and bright at the shore. The castle was old above them, and the grid ran through its foundations as it always had, the low, warm frequency, the hum in the bedrock that Harry had grown up feeling through the floorboards of a different building in Surrey, a frequency without a name for the first 11 years of his life, and now with several names, none of them entirely sufficient, and all of them closer than nothing. "Next year," Hermione said. It was not a question. It was orientation, the way she used statements to establish direction, pointing herself and anyone near her toward the forward horizon and beginning the analysis before the arrival. "Next year," Ron said. "We know considerably more than we did in September," Hermione said, and her pen was moving in the notebook, the notes page she opened when she was thinking aloud. "The grid's contact filter was demonstrated against a direct assault tonight, which gives us data on its operational parameters. We know Voldemort's frequency signature. Harry's read it at full amplitude, which means we can identify it from a distance in any future context. We know the Horcrux architecture and have 7 of the 9 possible identified." She paused. "We don't know which of the remaining candidates is the 6th one, and which might be the 7th, and the 7th is." "The 7th is complicated," Harry said. Hermione looked at him. Her pen stopped. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been carrying a theory in the notebook at 45 degrees position for several months, and is looking at the person who has confirmed it without saying it out loud, and is deciding whether to say it aloud now or let it remain in the 45-degree position for a while longer. She looked at him, he looked at her. The theory sat between them in the warm air of the hospital wing, unspoken and entirely present. "Later," Harry said. "Later," she said. She closed the notebook. She reopened the book on her knee, the one she'd been not reading, and this time she actually read it, which was its own kind of signal, the signal of a person standing down from alert state and returning to standard operations, trusting that standard operations were, for now, appropriate. Ron said, "The chess game was brilliant," Hermione said without looking up from the book. "I've said so. I'm not going to keep saying it, but it was and it remains true, and you should stop being modest about it." Ron looked at Harry. Harry said, "She's right. Ron looked at his arm in the sling. He looked at the pasties. He looked at the window, where the last of the evening's gold was holding in the specific stubborn way of May light that has decided not to be over yet. He said, "Yeah," which meant several things, and Harry received all of them. They sat in the hospital wing together while the evening decided whether it was finished and concluded that it wasn't quite. Hermione read. Ron ate another pasty. Harry sat at the end of the bed with his back against the bedpost, and the stone was not in his pocket anymore. Dumbledore had it, and the grid was warm in his chest at its normal register, steady and even, the low gold frequency he had always known. He thought about Dumbledore's hands in his lap, and the mirror showing him the room he had wanted, and the stone arriving in his palm without asking for it. He thought about the grid's filter, and what it meant that the filter was not his to deploy consciously, but simply was a structural function of being the nexus, the same way a river didn't decide to flow. He thought about the 7 symbols in Hermione's book, and how the grid had played all 7 like keys, and what that meant for next year and the year after, and all the years that were going to be difficult in ways September had not prepared him for. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs, 3 feet by 6 feet, the vent in the back wall, the grid running warm through the mattress springs in the cold dark. 11 years of carrying something immense in a very small space in the dark, alone. He looked at Ron. He looked at Hermione. The grid ran warm. He was not alone with it anymore, which was not a triumphant realization. It was quieter than that and more durable. It was the realization of ground. Here is the place where you stand. Here are the people you stand with. Here is the frequency you carry, and here are the people who can see it without flinching, and who have, since October and November and a Saturday morning in the library, simply factored it in. It was not small what they had done in factoring it in. He did not treat it as small. He did not treat it as everything either. That would have been a different kind of error. He ate the pasty. Ron got into an argument with Hermione about whether the chess game's middle sequence had been improvised or calculated, which was an argument Harry had heard 3 times already, and which always ended the same way, with Ron unable to prove his case and Hermione unable to prove hers, because the truth was that the distinction didn't matter as much as either of them wanted it to. Harry listened to the argument and said nothing, and watched the evening outside the window finish, deciding it was done, the gold receding, the dark arriving with the specific quiet authority of late May nights in Scotland that smell of rain and heather and the lake's deep water. Grid ran warm in his chest, steady, even, patient as a river that has always known where it's going. He had next year. He had the year after. He had the long, difficult, necessary work of what was coming, which was going to require everything, and which he was not going to do alone, and which he was going to do on his own terms, informed and choosing, not moved across a board by hands he couldn't see toward an outcome he hadn't agreed to. He was not afraid. He was not fearless either. That would have been dishonest, and the grid had no patience for dishonesty. What he was, sitting at the end of Ron's hospital bed with a pasty in his hand, and the grid at its baseline and Hermione still winning the argument, what he was ready, not for everything. For what was next, that was sufficient. That was exactly sufficient. That was, in the grid's frequency language that he had been learning since before he had words, the only preparation that was ever actually available. The next thing, with the people you'd chosen, from the ground you had. He finished the pasty. Outside, the dark arrived completely. The hospital wing settled into its nighttime quiet. And where below in the dungeons, Snape was sitting with the knowledge that Harry had neutralized Voldemort's direct approach through the grid's contact filter, which revised several of Snape's secondary source assumptions, and was going to require him to revise several more. And the revision was happening in the specific dense silence of a man whose internal monologue is working very hard and whose face is doing nothing. Somewhere above in the headmaster's office, Dumbledore was sitting with the Philosopher's Stone in his hands, and a decision he was beginning to make about it. And on the corner of his desk, the brass orrery was turning, and for once his hand was not being kept away from it by effort. It simply was not reaching for it, because it did not need to, because the thing he had been managing toward for a decade had tonight shown him that it did not need to be managed. Somewhere in Little Winging, Surrey, a cupboard under the stairs was 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, and held a fold-up cot and a hook in the wall, and a vent in the back that let in a bar of light on clear mornings. And in 10 days Harry would go back to it for the summer, and Vernon would make his coffee, and look at Harry and look away and look at the sternum and look away. And Harry would make the breakfast, and do the washing up and lie on the cot in the dark, and feel the grid run its warm, even frequency through the mattress springs. It would be the same cupboard. It would not be the same dark. He had been in the room, the real one, the one the mirror had shown him, had sat in it, approximately, with the people he'd chosen beside him. He knew what it felt like. He knew what he was going back to and what he was coming back to. The grid ran warm. He knew both.